They laughed when Lisa, a newly divorced mom, spent just $300 on a rusted, forgotten trailer, calling it worthless, unlivable, a mistake. But the moment she began tearing down its walls, she uncovered secrets no one expected. Ledgers of vanished men, letters never sent, maps of hidden routes, and sealed tin boxes worth millions. Suddenly, her ruin wasn't just shelter. It was of all the betrayal, fear, and a history powerful people wanted erased. What would you do if the home everyone mocked held a legacy that could change everything? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The grass around the lot had grown high enough to hide the broken glass scattered near the road, and a bent chain-link fence leaned as though it had given up years ago. Lisa Moreno stepped carefully, her sneakers crunching over gravel and weeds that had pushed their way through the cracked asphalt. At the far end of the row of faded trailers sat the one no one wanted. Its aluminum siding, once a pale cream color, had rusted into streaks of orange and brown. Windows sagged on loose frames, some patched with cardboard, others sealed with strips of duct tape that had long since peeled back. The porch was nothing more than a sheet of warped plywood resting on cinder blocks, and the door hung slightly off-center. The handwritten sign stuck to the metal siding was blunt, $300, as is. Lisa pulled her jacket closer as the autumn wind pressed against her. The smell of damp earth and oil from the nearby highway carried across the lot. Her children stood a few steps behind her, uncertain whether to come closer. Ava, 13, clutched her phone like it was a lifeline, eyes scanning the sagging trailer with suspicion. Mateo, only 9, shuffled his feet and picked at the frayed strap of his backpack, watching his mother more than the home in front of them. Their silence weighed heavier than any words they could have spoken. A man in a stained ball cap appeared from the office at the corner of the lot, clipboard in hand. He didn't bother with small talk. "It's been sitting empty for near 10 years, he said, jerking his thumb toward the trailer. "Lady pass. No family claimed it. The county just wants it off the books. $300 and it's yours. Cash." His tone carried no hope, only impatience. Lisa nodded, the envelope in her purse pressing like a stone against her ribs. It was nearly all she had left after the divorce settlement and months of temp jobs. $300 wasn't security, but it was a chance at something that was hers alone. She imagined a roof, no matter how rusted, that belonged to her and her children. The laughter of her ex-husband's family echoed in her memory, mocking her for thinking she could manage on her own. They had said she would crawl back within a year. Standing there in the brittle weeds, she felt the sting of those words and tightened her grip on the strap of her purse. The man led them to the door, jiggling the lock until it clicked open. The smell that drifted out was a mix of mildew, old wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the narrow hall revealed stained carpet worn thin to the plywood beneath, wallpaper peeled in long curls, exposing yellow plasterboard. A single chair sat overturned in the living room, next to a stack of magazines from the 1980s. Lisa stepped across the threshold, her weight making the floor groan. Ava wrinkled her nose. "We can't live here," she whispered. Mateo pressed close to his mother's side, eyes wide. "Does it have heat?" Lisa didn't answer right away. She ran her hand along the paneling, feeling how it shifted against the frame. Every flaw was obvious. Every repair would cost more than she had. But the truth was simple. No one else wanted it, which meant no one else could take it from her. For $300, she would own walls that, however thin, belonged to her family alone. The man in the ball cap shrugged as he handed over the paperwork. "Sign here. Keys come with it. What you do after is up to you." Her hand trembled as she wrote her name, the ink catching in spots on the weathered paper. The man tucked the envelope of cash into his jacket, without counting it, then left him standing alone in the doorway. Lisa exhaled slowly, the keys cold and heavy in her palm. Behind her, Ava leaned against the frame, arms crossed, muttering that the place would collapse in the next storm. Mateo whispered that maybe they could paint the outside blue. Lisa looked at the sagging roof line, the broken windows, the patches of rust that seemed to eat through the walls. She felt fear, yes, but also something else, an ember of defiance that flared against the ridicule she had endured. She closed her fingers around the keys until the edges dug into her skin. The trailer was rusted, unwanted, nearly forgotten, but it was hers, and whatever it hid inside, she was ready to find it. The community center smelled faintly of dust and coffee, its folding chairs arranged in uneven rows around a makeshift auction stage. Old ceiling fans stirred the air in lazy circles, doing little to ease the heat of too many bodies crammed into one place. Lisa Moreno sat near the back, her children beside her, the envelope of bills hidden deep in her purse. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her ribs, heavier than it should have been. It wasn't just money. It was what remained of her pride, her independence, and the narrow margin between stability and collapse. The auctioneer, a wiry man in a wrinkled shirt and BOLO tie, flipped through a stack of papers with practiced disinterest. One by one, he called out the items up for bid: old lawnmowers, broken down vans, a battered piano no one wanted. The crowd murmured, neighbors elbowing each other, joking about the junk being passed off as treasure. Every so often, someone shouted a bid, and the auctioneer rattled off numbers with the speed of habit. When he reached the last lot, the tone of the room shifted. 1974 Skyline trailer, he announced, his voice dry. Located on Lot 14, Meadowbrook Park. Needs work. He didn't bother to hide his smirk. Starting bid, $300. The crowd laughed, a low ripple at first, then swelling into open mockery. A woman in the front row leaned toward her husband, whispering loudly enough for half the room to hear. 300? More like 300 just to haul the junk away. Her husband chuckled. You'd need a hazmat suit to walk inside. Another man shouted from the side. Should pay someone to take it, not the other way around. Laughter broke out again, sharp and careless. Lisa kept her eyes fixed on the floor, but the words still struck. She felt Ava stiffen beside her, the teenager's face heating in embarrassment. Mateo's small hand gripped hers tighter, as if he could anchor her against the weight of their ridicule. The auctioneer waited a moment, scanning the room. No hands went up. People shook their heads, still chuckling, already ready to move on. All right then, he said, tapping the microphone. Lot 14, going once. Lisa raised her hand. The sound in the room shifted. Chairs creaked as heads turned toward her. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A sharp voice called out from the back, one she recognized immediately. Her cousin Marisol. Lisa, you've lost your mind. A chorus followed. She's buying that dump, someone muttered. With kids? You can't even plug a toaster in without blowing a fuse in those things. The auctioneer squinted at her as though she hadn't understood the rules. $300 bid. Any advance. He waited, but no one challenged it. The crowd's laughter had turned brittle, edged with disbelief. Going once. Going twice. Marisol stood now, arms folded, her jewelry catching the fluorescent lights. You think that trailer's gonna save you? It's not a fresh start. It's a coffin. You're dragging those kids into a graveyard on wheels. The words were meant to sting, and they did. But Lisa kept her face calm, her hands still raised. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a hollow crack. Sold. Lot 14, to the lady in the back. The room erupted again, snickers, whispers, shaking heads. Lisa felt each sound like a pebble thrown against glass, small but relentless. Yet beneath it all, she felt something else taking root. It wasn't confidence, not yet, but it was steadier than despair. She had done what no one else would. She had taken a risk they all mocked, and for the first time in years, she held the deed, however meager, in her own name. As people filed out, voices trailed after her like smoke. She regretted by winter. Kids deserve better. 300 wasted. Ava walked stiffly, head down, cheeks flushed with humiliation. Mateo clung close, whispering, "It'll be okay, Mom." Lisa pressed her palm against the envelope in her purse, feeling the edges of the deed through the paper. Around her, mockery still echoed, but she held on to the silence within herself, sharper than their laughter. No one else wanted it. No one else believed in it. That was precisely why she had chosen it. And whatever secrets that rusted trailer held in its walls, she would find them before anyone else had the chance. The county clerk's office was quiet except for the hum of an old fluorescent light that flickered near the back corner. A counter separated Lisa from the clerk, a gray-haired woman whose expression suggested she had seen this kind of desperation before. The papers were spread out in neat stacks. Thin sheets that looked almost harmless in their simplicity, but Lisa felt the weight of every line she was about to sign. Her pen hovered just above the first signature block, her hand trembling despite her efforts to steady it. She thought of the voices from the auction hall, the laughter that had followed her out into the parking lot. The words had followed her home, whispering that she had thrown away her last savings on a pile of rust. Marisol's sharp voice still rang the loudest, warning that she was condemning her children to rot with her in a place no one else wanted. Yet here she was, pressing the pen down to the page, writing her name in careful strokes, as if claiming her own defiance in ink. Ava leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, phone clutched in her hand. Her eyes flicked between the papers and her mother's face, narrowed with teenage suspicion that edged into fear. Mateo stood closer, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack, rocking slightly on his heels. He didn't say a word, but his wide eyes watched every move Lisa made, as though he were waiting for someone to step in and tell her to stop. The clerk gathered the signed pages and slid them into a file folder. Without ceremony, she reached into a drawer and produced a ring of keys, heavy and rusted, their metal dull with years of neglect. She set them on the counter with a metallic clatter that seemed far too loud in the stillness of the office. Lisa hesitated before reaching for them, her hand shaking again as if the keys themselves carried all the weight of the risk she had taken. When her fingers closed around the cold metal, she felt both a surge of ownership and a chill of fear. These were not just keys to a door. They were keys to a life no one believed she could build. She slipped them into her pocket, the sound of metal against fabric oddly final. Ava shifted, her glance toward Mateo a silent exchange of doubt. Lisa caught the look, but said nothing. She had no promises to offer them. Not yet. All she had was a trailer. The deed now folded inside her purse, and the keys biting into her palm with their rough edges. When they stepped back into the afternoon light, the sky hung low with gray clouds, the kind that promised rain before evening. The parking lot stretched empty, cracked pavement spotted with weeds. Lisa drew a breath, longer and deeper than she had planned, and looked at her children. Ava avoided her eyes, staring at the cracked sidewalk as though it might offer an escape. Mateo shuffled closer, slipping his hand into hers without speaking. They walked to the car in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot. Lisa unlocked the driver's side door, the keys in her purse rattling with each movement, reminding her of the responsibility now pressed onto her shoulders. She slid behind the wheel, staring for a moment at her own reflection in the rear-view mirror. The face looking back was lined with exhaustion, but there was something steadier in her eyes than she remembered seeing before. The drive to the trailer park was quiet. Ava tapped at her phone screen, pretending indifference, while Mateo leaned against the window, watching trees blur past. Lisa gripped the steering wheel tightly, the rough ridges of the trailer keys still imprinted against her palm. When the weedy lot finally came into view, she slowed, pulling into the gravel path that led to the rusted shell she had just claimed. The trailer sat unchanged, sagging against its cinder blocks, rust streaking its sides like old scars. Lisa parked the car and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. Her children exchanged another look in the back seat, one that carried both skepticism and fear. She noticed it, but she kept her eyes fixed on the door of the trailer. The keys were in her hand again before she realized she had reached for them. They felt heavier than before, as though they had absorbed the weight of every glance, every whispered judgment. Her hand trembled as she pushed the car door open and stepped out. With Ava and Mateo lingering behind her, she walked up to the sagging plywood steps, each creak underfoot sounding like a test. At the threshold, she lifted the keys to the lock. Her hand shook again, but she pressed forward, sliding the rusted metal into place. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a reluctant turn and a hollow click, the lock gave way. The door groaned open, and the stale air of abandonment poured out to meet them. Lisa stood in the doorway, the keys still clutched in her shaking hand, and for the first time since signing the papers, She felt the full enormity of what she had done. Behind her, Ava's uncertainty deepened, and Mateo pressed closer, his small voice barely rising above a whisper. "Is this really ours?" Lisa didn't answer immediately. She tightened her grip on the keys until the ridges cut into her skin and stepped inside. The sky had darkened by the time Lisa coaxed the trailer door open with its stiff hinges, and the smell of mildew poured out like something that had been waiting years to escape. She stepped inside first, brushing her shoulder against the frame, and flicked the light switch near the door out of instinct. Nothing happened. The silence pressed in heavier than before, broken only by the sound of her children lingering outside, hesitant to follow. When Mateo finally climbed the shallow steps, his sneakers squeaked on the warped linoleum, and Ava came after, holding her phone high like a lantern. The weak glow cast long shadows across the living room, picking out every flaw that time had carved into the place. The ceiling sagged in uneven patches, water stains spreading outward like ink on paper. Where the rain had already begun, droplets slipped through tiny holes in the roof, landing with a soft, steady patter onto the floor below. The carpet smelled of rot and felt spongy beneath their shoes. Lisa moved slowly, afraid her weight might push through one of the weaker boards. She kept telling herself it was only surface damage, nothing she couldn't patch or cover, but the voice in her head carried more doubt than certainty. Ava covered her nose with her sleeve. "Mom, it stinks. We can't stay here." Her tone was sharp, the edge of fear masked as defiance. Lisa ignored her for a moment and opened a nearby cabinet, only to find a nest of shredded paper and droppings left by mice that had claimed the space long before she arrived. She shut it quickly, forcing her face to stay calm. Mateo flinched as something small darted across the floor in the beam of Ava's phone light. A gray blur vanished beneath the wall paneling. His voice trembled. "Was that a rat?" Lisa crouched, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Just mice," she said softly, though she wasn't certain. "It's nothing we can't handle." She wished her words carried more conviction. Thunder cracked outside, rattling the thin window panes, and then the Real storm broke. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, hammering the roof until it sounded like the trailer was being pelted with stones. Water trickled faster through the weak spots, dripping on the floor in steady streams. One leak near the window splashed against the sill, leaving streaks across the faded wallpaper that peeled away in damp curls. The smell of wet plaster thickened in the air, mixing with a sharp odor of rust and mold. Ava backed toward the door, her face pale in the glow of her phone. "We can't live here. Please, Mom. Let's go back to the apartment. We'll figure something else out." Mateo clung to Lisa's arm, his voice smaller than usual. "I don't like it. It feels wrong." His eyes darted to the corners where shadows moved, every creak of the walls convincing him something was crawling just out of sight. Lisa drew in a deep breath, steadying herself against the tide of fear radiating from her children. She looked around at the peeling walls, the puddles spreading on the floor, the sagging ceiling that trembled with every gust of wind. It was undeniable. The trailer was a ruin, but beneath the ruin, she felt something different, a flicker of ownership, a stubborn refusal to give in. She had stood through laughter and whispers at the auction, signed the papers in front of the county clerk, and held the rusted keys until they cut into her palm. Now, with the storm raging overhead and her children begging to leave, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down harder than the rain. "We'll get through tonight," she said finally. Her voice firm though her chest ached with doubt. She pulled a blanket from the bag she had carried in and spread it across the driest part of the floor she could find. The children hesitated, unwilling to move from the doorway, but eventually Mateo crept closer, curling against her side. Ava sat apart, arms folded, staring at the rainwater dripping steadily from the ceiling. Lisa wrapped the blanket tighter around her son and glanced at her daughter, who looked older in that moment than her 13 years should have allowed. The storm outside raged on and the trailer shuddered under its weight, but inside she forced herself to sit still, to show her children that they were not broken, even if the roof above them was. The night stretched long. Every drip echoed. Every scratch behind the walls carried too much meaning. Every groan of the wind seemed to question her choice. Yet Lisa did not move. She kept her hand on Mateo's shoulder, kept her gaze steady on Ava, and held on to the only truth she could manage. The keys in her pocket were still hers, and this broken place, for all its flaws, belonged to them now. Morning light filtered weakly through the grime-coated windows, casting the living room in a dim, muted glow. The storm had passed, but the trailer carried the scent of damp plaster and mildew like a second skin. Lisa rose stiffly from the blanket on the floor, her back aching from a night spent listening to drips and the restless shifting of her children. Mateo was still asleep, curled into the warmth of his pillow, while Ava sat awake against the wall, earbuds in, pretending not to notice her mother moving about. Lisa didn't press her to help. She knew the girl's silence was her form of protest. Lisa brushed her palms against her jeans and turned toward the cabinets lining the far wall. Some hung crooked on their hinges, their paint chipped into flakes that clung to her fingertips when she touched them. She opened the first one cautiously, half expecting another nest of vermin. Instead, the shelves revealed a stack of mismatched dishes, their porcelain cracked into spiderweb lines. She lifted one gingerly, tracing the fracture that ran through its center. They were useless as dishes, too damaged to hold food or water, yet she couldn't bring herself to throw them away. Someone had eaten from these plates. Someone had placed them carefully on these shelves long before the roof sagged and the floor softened with rot. Further back in the cabinet, she found a bundle of yellowed magazines tied together with twine, so brittle it snapped the moment she touched it. The cover showed glossy images of cars, recipes, and smiling families from decades past. Their colors had faded into muted blues and browns, the paper curling at the edges. Lisa thumbed through one and found handwritten notes scrawled in the margins, recipes altered with careful numbers, circles drawn around advertisements. The pages felt heavy with a kind of presence, as though the lives of the people who once lived here had been pressed into the ink. She stacked the magazines carefully on the counter, intending to sort them later, and turned her attention to the narrow closet by the door. The sliding panel stuck halfway before giving way with a sharp tug, revealing boxes stacked unevenly. Dust clung to the cardboard, and when she pulled the first one down, a cloud rose that made her cough. Inside lay clothing folded but brittle with age, dresses with bright floral patterns dulled by years of neglect, shirts yellowed at the seams. She held one up to the light, the fabric nearly disintegrating in her hands. At the bottom of the box, she found a photo frame wrapped in a ragged dish towel. The glass had long since cracked, but beneath it a black and white photograph remained intact. Her figure stood in front of the very trailer she now owned. A man in work clothes, his arm draped around a woman in a patterned dress, with two children, one boy, one girl, standing stiffly at their sides. Their smiles looked forced, the kind held too long for the camera, but their eyes told something else. They stood with the trailer behind them, not as if it was a burden, but as though it was a claim, something they were proud to show the world. Lisa's chest tightened as she studied the photograph. The trailer in the background was the same, but different, its siding bright, its roof straight, its porch freshly painted. It was hard to believe the ruin she had stepped into was once the proud backdrop of a family portrait. She traced her fingertip across the children's faces, imagining their laughter echoing in the narrow halls. Ava noticed her staring and pulled out her earbuds. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice carrying more curiosity than judgment for the first time since they arrived. "I don't know," Lisa admitted softly. She turned the frame over, searching for writing on the back, but found nothing. No names, no dates, just the faint marks of age. But they lived here once. Maybe they left everything behind. Mateo stirred awake and joined them, blinking against the light. He leaned over his mother's arm to look at the picture, his voice hushed as though the family in the photo might hear. "Do you think they were happy here?" Lisa didn't answer right away. She looked again at the cracked dishes, the scribbled notes in the magazines, the clothes folded and forgotten. The walls might be peeling, the roof might leak, but the photograph proved the trailer had once been more than a shell. It had held meals, laughter, arguments, and secrets. It had been a home. She set the frame carefully on the counter, her hand lingering on it longer than necessary. "They must have been," she said finally, though she wasn't sure whether it was for children's sake or her own. As she spoke, rainwater dripped from the ceiling into the pail she had placed the night before, and the sound echoed against the silence. The trailer still felt broken, But now, surrounded by relics of the past, Lisa sensed it had a story waiting for her to uncover. One that no laughter in auction, no sneers from family could erase. The afternoon sun slanted low through the trailer windows, spilling a hazy light across the living room, where dust floated in restless clouds. Lisa had decided they would start with the walls, if only to strip away the damp, peeling wallpaper that had curled into brittle ribbons. She rolled up her sleeves and pried at the edge of a panel with a rusted screwdriver, the tool slipping against softwood swollen from years of leaks. Mateo watched on the floor, his legs folded beneath him, while Ava sat with her back to the couch, scrolling her phone and pretending not to notice. The panel came loose with a groan, revealing insulation that crumbled at Lisa's touch. She tugged again, splinters biting her fingertips, until the warped board snapped free. The sound startled Mateo, who laughed nervously. "It's like the house is fighting back," he said, though his eyes flickered with unease. Lisa dropped the broken piece onto a pile already forming in the corner. The air smelled of damp paper and something faintly metallic, a scent that seemed to rise from deep inside the walls. She reached for the next section, but before she could wedge the screwdriver under it, Mateo leaned closer and rapped his knuckles gently against the exposed frame. The hollow sound that answered back froze him in place. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Lisa glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "Hear what?" He knocked again. The echo was unmistakable this time, not the dull thud of wood against insulation, but a hollow resonance, like striking the side of an empty chest. Mateo's face lit with a mix of fear and excitement. "There's something back there," he said quickly, glancing toward his sister as if hoping she had heard it too. Ava lowered her phone reluctantly, rolling her eyes but unable to hide her curiosity. "It's probably just rats. Or a broken pipe." Mateo shook his head, his small fists tapping a rhythm along the wall. "No, listen. It's different here than over there." He moved a few feet to the side, knocked again, and the sound shifted back to the dull thud. Returning to the first spot, the hollow echo returned, faint but clear. Lisa crouched beside him, pressing her palm flat against the panel. She felt the faint vibration as he tapped, the emptiness that lay just behind the thin layer of wood. She had worked enough odd jobs after the divorce to recognize the sound of space where there shouldn't be any. Something had been built into the wall, deliberately or by accident. Her pulse quickened as she reached for the screwdriver again, this time more carefully, sliding it beneath the panel at the spot Mateo had discovered. The wood resisted, nails groaning as she pried them free. Mateo hovered close, his breath held, his hands twitching with the urge to help, but staying still under his mother's sharp glance. Ava, despite her skepticism, stood now, moving closer to see. The panel gave way with a sharp crack, collapsing outward in Lisa's hands. A gap yawned behind it, no larger than a few feet across, hidden neatly between studs. Dust and fragments of insulation spilled into the room, making Mateo cough. He waved it away and leaned forward eagerly, peering into the cavity. "It's empty," he murmured, disappointment in his tone. Lisa steadied him with a hand on his shoulder, her own eyes scanning the darkness. The space was shallow, but not entirely bare. A sliver would jutted from one side, and what looked like the corner of a cardboard box pressed against the inner frame. She reached in cautiously, the narrow cavity forcing her arm at an awkward angle. Her fingers brushed against something solid, then something softer, wrapped in paper that crumbled beneath her touch. Mateo's voice trembled with excitement. "Is it something hidden? Like a treasure?" Ava scoffed, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "Or maybe it's just trash. People stash junk in walls all the time." Lisa pulled her hand back, dust clinging to her skin. She could see now that there was more than one box stacked inside the hollow, though the narrow opening would make it difficult to remove them without dismantling more of the wall. She turned to her children, her expression unreadable. "This isn't just rats," she said quietly. The hollow sound that had caught Mateo's attention was the first clue. Behind the rot and rust, the trailer was holding something. The room fell silent, except for the drip of rain, still working its way through the roof. Ava's phone screen dimmed as she let fall into her lap, her eyes fixed on the dark opening. Mateo grinned. caught between fear and exhilaration, the moment already growing in his imagination. Lisa stood slowly, brushing her hands against her jeans, and looked at the broken panel at her feet. What had seemed like a ruin of no value might hold something after all. Something left behind for reasons she couldn't yet guess. She didn't say the word treasure, but the thoughts settled in the room like dust, clinging to them as firmly as the scent of mildew. The hollow sound Mateo had noticed was more than just an echo. It was the beginning of a story the walls had been keeping secret for decades. The cavity in the wall lingered like a secret they had only half uncovered, its darkness beckoning, but refusing to reveal everything at once. Lisa had decided they would stop for the evening, but Ava lingered near the broken panel. Her eyes narrowed in the dim light. She wasn't one to show much interest in the trailer, usually retreating behind her phone, but now she traced her fingers along the raw with the exposed frame. The flashlight from her phone lit the grain, catching on rough edges where the old paneling had been pried away. "Mom," she said after a moment, her voice carrying a mix of hesitation and curiosity. "Come look at this." Lisa set aside the trash bag she'd been filling with scraps of wallpaper and crossed the room. Mateo was already beside his sister, crouched low, trying to angle his head for a better look. Ava tilted her phone, so the light fell across a section that was just above Mateo's eye level. There, carved into the frame, were letters and numbers. The cuts were shallow but deliberate, the strokes uneven but legible. G to R, 1978. For a moment, none of them spoke. The carved initials seemed to hum with a kind of presence, as though they had been waiting for decades to be seen again. Lisa leaned closer, brushing away a layer of dust that had settled into the grooves. The letters were sharp in places, dulled in others, worn down by time but unmistakable. GR. Ava read aloud, her tone soft but steady. And 1978. She looked at her mother, the glow of her phone screen reflecting in her eyes. "Who do you think it was?" Lisa thought back to the faded photograph she had found in the closet, the one with the family standing proudly before the trailer in its brighter days. Could one of them have pressed these letters into the frame? The year fit. 1978 wasn't long after the picture must have been taken. She imagined a boy with a pocket knife, carving his initials when no one was looking, leaving a mark he couldn't have known would outlive the shine of the siding, the strength of the roof, even the people themselves. Mateo ran his fingers over the letters, careful not to splinter his skin. "Maybe it was a kid in the photo," he suggested eagerly. "The boy, maybe his name started with G." Ava frowned, considering. Or maybe it was the dad, Gerald or something. Her voice was skeptical, but not dismissive. She leaned back slightly, phone still held high, as though recording the moment in her mind. Lisa straightened slowly, her gaze drifting across the room. The initials changed the way she looked at the trailer. It wasn't just decay and mildew. It had once belonged to someone who wanted to leave a trace, even if it was nothing more than letters scratched into wood. She wondered about that year, 1978, what it had meant for them. Was it a declaration of pride, a way to mark ownership of a life they were building? Or had it been something quieter, carved in solitude, a boy hiding from the arguments of adults in the cramped rooms? The rain had slowed outside, the drip from the ceiling less insistent, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier now. Ava turned off her phone light for a moment, and the initials disappeared into darkness, as if they had never existed. She flicked it back on quickly, unwilling to let them vanish again. "It's weird," she murmured, almost to herself. "It feels like someone wanted us to find it." Lisa said nothing, but the thought lodged deep inside her. She placed her hand on the frame, her fingers covering part of the carved year. The grooves pressed faintly into her skin, as if bridging the distance between her and whoever had stood here nearly half a century ago. Mateo yawned and leaned against her arm, his small body heavy with the weight of the day. Ava stayed a moment longer, eyes still fixed on the letters, before slipping her phone back into her pocket. The glow faded, but the image of the initials lingered in their minds. Lisa looked around the room one last time before guiding the children toward their makeshift bedding on the floor. As she settled under the blanket, she replayed the sight of those carved letters. The trailer had seemed empty when she first stepped inside, abandoned and forgotten. Now it felt different, haunted not by ghosts but by memories pressed into its bones, reminders that lives had once unfolded in these narrow rooms. The initials were proof that someone had cared enough to leave a mark, and in that small act, the past had reached into her present. As she closed her eyes, Lisa realized the trailer was no longer just a roof over their heads. It was a puzzle, a story etched into wooden walls, waiting for them to uncover the rest. The next day brought clearer skies, though the air inside the trailer remained heavy with dampness. Lisa had armed herself with gloves and a crowbar, determined to open more of the wall where Mateo had discovered the hollow. Ava was less enthusiastic, but she hovered near the doorway, watching as her mother worked. Mateo stood close, excitement buzzing in every tap of his foot. The children sensed this was no longer just about repairs. There was something hidden here, and it was theirs to uncover. Lisa pressed the crowbar against the frame and pried, though it splintered with a reluctant crack, each nail giving way with a shriek of rust. The panel finally bent outward, releasing another spill of dust and insulation that made Mateo cough into his sleeve. He brushed away quickly, too eager to complain, and peered into the cavity as if expecting treasure to gleam in the dark. At first, the space revealed little beyond scraps of paper and a few mouse droppings. Lisa sighed, ready to dismiss it, but then her eyes caught a rectangular-shaped lodge between two studs. She reached in carefully, her gloved fingers brushing against something stiff, wrapped in cloth that had long since frayed to threads. She tugged gently until it came free, revealing a book bound in cracked leather, its surface mottled with mold. Mateo's eyes widened. "What is it?" Lisa turned it over, the leather creaking under her grip. A small brass clasp, tarnished and bent, had once secured it shut but now hung useless. She opened the cover slowly, the spine groaning like an old hinge. Inside, pages yellow with age revealed neat handwriting, rows of names and numbers written in a hand both careful and hurried, as though the writer had worked quickly but with practiced precision. The ink had faded to brown, and in some places, water damage blurred the lines, but enough remained to be unmistakable. Ava stepped closer, curiosity overriding her reluctance. She leaned over her mother's shoulder, squinting at the faded writing. "It's like a list," she said, her voice uncertain. "Names. And then what are those? Amounts?" Lisa traced one entry with her gloved finger, a name she didn't recognize, C. Delaney, followed by a string of numbers arranged like columns. Below it, another, and then another. Some names had check marks beside them, others small crosses. In the margins, there were symbols she didn't understand, looping marks and short dashes that seemed to form a private code. Mateo bounced on his heels. "It's like a secret book. Maybe it's money, or..." His voice trailed off as the weight of possibility hung in the air. Lisa felt a chill settle in her chest. The ledger wasn't a child's game. The careful structure of the writing, the repeated columns, the consistency, it had purpose. Whoever had lived here before hadn't simply scribbled notes. These were records, precise and intentional. She closed the book halfway and stared at its worn cover, the smell of damp paper seeping through her gloves. Ava crossed her arms, though her eyes stayed fixed on the book. "This doesn't look like something people forget in a wall. They hid it here on purpose." Lisa nodded slowly, her mind racing. She remembered the initials carved into frame, GR 1978, and the photograph of the family standing proud in front of the trailer. Could the ledger belong to that same man, the father with his arm around his wife? Had he hidden it here when life inside these walls still felt secure? Mateo leaned closer again, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Do you think it's bad stuff? Like something people weren't supposed to write down?" Lisa closed the book fully and held it against her chest. The leather was cold and damp, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She thought of her cousin's mocking words, her family's laughter at the auction, the neighbors who said the trailer was a mistake. They had seen only rust and rot. But this was something else, something buried for decades. "We don't know yet," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. But it mattered to someone, enough to hide it here. The children followed her as she carried the book to the small counter by the window, laying it down with care as though it might crumble under the weight of their questions. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the lot. The trailer creaked softly in the settling air, the sound of Oldwood holding on to its secrets. Lisa rested her hand on the cover one last time. The ledger was more than paper and ink. It was a doorway into a story she had not asked to inherit. But it was hers now, pulled from the walls of a place everyone else had dismissed as worthless. She didn't know yet whether it would bring answers or danger, but she knew one thing with certainty. The trailer was not empty. It was speaking page by page, and she would have to decide how much of its voice she was willing to hear. The photograph sat on the counter, propped against a stack of yellowed magazines Lisa had pulled from the closet days earlier. She found herself staring at it in odd moments, when the children were quiet or when the rain outside blurred the windows with steady curtain. The family in the image never changed. The father's stiff smile, the mother's patterned dress, the children standing like they had been told not to move. Yet each time Lisa looked, she noticed something new. The crease of tension in the man's brow, the way the boy's hand curled behind his back, the faint shadows that made the siding of the trailer gleam as if it were a prize. The initials carved into the frame, GR 1978, wouldn't leave her mind, nor would the ledger with its list of names and numbers. At night she lay awake, the sound of water dripping into buckets around the trailer, keeping her company, wondering who GR had been and why he had hidden his records in the walls. Curiosity finally pushed her to act. She drove into town one morning after dropping Mateo at school and convincing Ava to stay behind with a neighbor. The library still kept an archive of local newspapers, bound in heavy volumes and stacked in tall cabinets that smelled of dust and glue. Lisa asked the librarian, a kind woman with steel gray hair, for help searching the late 70s. The woman raised an eyebrow at the request, but guided her toward the shelves, pointing out where the microfilm reels were kept for the years she wanted. Lisa threaded the machine with clumsy hands, scrolling frame by frame through headlines that told of factory strikes, town council disputes, and long-forgotten tragedies. She nearly missed it at first, a small article buried on the third page of a 1979 edition. The headline read, "Local worker missing. Gerald Rowe last seen leaving textile plant." Her chest tightened as she read. Rowe was described as 34, employed at the Whitaker textile plant, married with 2 children. He had left work one evening in June and never arrived home. His car was found days later abandoned near the river, but there was no sign of him. Authorities had searched the water without result. The article quoted a supervisor who called him quiet, dependable, not the type to run off. The piece ended with a plea from his wife, asking anyone with information to come forward. Lisa leaned back in the stiff library chair, her pulse quickening. Gerald Rowe, the same initials carved into her trailer's frame, the same year etched into the wood. She flipped through more reels, scanning headlines from the months that followed. A brief follow-up appeared in August, noting that no new leads had been found, that the case had grown cold. His family eventually moved away, their whereabouts unreported. She left the library with photocopies folded carefully in her bag, her mind buzzing with the connection. Back at the trailer, she laid the copies beside the photograph, staring at the man in the work clothes. Gerald Rowe's name now belonged to him, giving shape to the stiff figure who had once stood proudly before the same trailer she now occupied. When Ava returned that evening, she picked up the article and read it silently. "So he just disappeared?" she asked, her voice tinged with something between awe and unease. Lisa nodded, tapping the edge of the ledger still resting on the counter. "And he left us behind." Mateo leaned close to the photograph, his finger hovering over the carved smile of the man. "Do you think that's why he hid the book? Because something bad was happening?" Lisa didn't answer right away. She thought about the cryptic numbers, the names with check marks and crosses. She thought about a man who worked at a factory tied to rumors of corruption, who walked away one evening and never returned. She thought of a family forced to leave everything behind, their dishes, their clothes, their magazines, their photograph, left for strangers to find decades later. Her gaze drifted toward the cracked walls, the rust that streaked the siding, the leaks she was still learning how to contain. The trailer was more than a shell of poverty and neglect. It was a witness. It had held the story of Gerald Rowe in silence, waiting for someone to pry back its panels and listen. Lisa pressed her palm against the photograph, not to claim it, but to acknowledge it. For the first time since signing the deed, she felt less alone. She had stepped into a place mocked and dismissed, but it was more than ruins. It was a place that had carried a secret through decades, one she now carried forward. The man in the photo was no longer nameless. His initials carved into the wood, his ledger hidden in the walls, his absence recorded in the brittle pages of an old newspaper. Together, they formed the outline of a story she could no longer ignore. The knock came on a Sunday morning, sharp and insistent against the thin trailer door. Lisa had been sorting through a stack of old magazines, setting aside the ones with scrawled notes in the margins, when the sound made her flinch. Ava glanced up from where she sat curled on the couch with her phone, already sensing who it might be. Mateo froze, a spoon of cereal halfway to his mouth, and then whispered, "It's Aunt Marisol, isn't it?" Lisa smoothed her hair with one hand and opened the door. Marisol stood on the sagging plywood step, dressed in a pressed blouse and slacks that looked more suited for a meeting than a visit. Her sharp eyes swept over the interior before she had even been invited inside, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're really doing this," Marisol said flatly, stepping past her sister without waiting. She glanced at the patched leaks, the buckets lined up under weak spots in the ceiling, the uneven floorboards beneath her heels. "Lisa, this is madness." Lisa closed the door and turned slowly. "It's a start," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Marisol spun to face her. "A start? It's a hole in the ground with aluminum walls. You're sinking what little you have left into a wreck. Sell it now before it takes every cent and every ounce of sanity you've got." Ava set her phone aside, her expression guarded, while Mateo shrank back into his chair. Lisa stepped between her sister and her children, folding her arms. "You think I don't know what it looks like? I know it better than anyone. But it's ours. I signed the papers. I have the deed. We're not leaving." Marisol's voice softened only slightly, though the edge of judgment remained. "Lisa, I'm saying this because I care. You've been through enough already. The divorce, the job changes, the money. And now you're dragging those kids through this? Do you want them to remember their childhood in a place with rats and leaks?" Lisa's jaw tightened. "They'll remember a place we made our own, even if it takes time, even if it's hard." Her sister sighed, exasperated, and picked up the old ledger Lisa had left on the counter. She flipped through the brittle pages with a skeptical snort. "And what is this? Some old notebook from the walls? You're hoarding junk now? This is how it starts. Clinging to scraps, convincing yourself they mean something." Lisa snatched the book back, her fingers tight around the worn leather cover. "It's not junk. It belonged to the man who lived here before. Gerald Rowe. He disappeared in 1979. This," she said, holding the ledger up, "was hidden in the walls. Doesn't that tell you something? This place has history. It's not just rot." Marisol shook her head, already unconvinced. "History doesn't fix roofs. History doesn't keep your kids warm in January. You're chasing ghosts, Lisa, and ghosts don't pay bills." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain dripping into a bucket in the corner. Ava's eyes flicked between her mother and her aunt, caught between doubt and loyalty. Mateo clutched the edge of the table, silent but wide-eyed. Lisa finally drew a breath. "You don't have to understand. You don't even have to approve. But don't come here and tell me to give up when this is the first thing in years that feels like mine. I won't sell. Not now, not ever." Marisol studied her, the sharpness in her gaze softening just slightly, though her voice carried no concession. "Stubborn as always. I just hope you're not teaching those kids to follow you into mistakes." She turned toward the door, heels clicking against the weak floor. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The door shut behind her, leaving the trailer in silence once more. Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and set the ledger back on the counter. Ava reached for her phone again, but not before Lisa noticed the way her daughter's eyes lingered on her, measuring her resolve. Mateo slipped from his chair and came to her side, wrapping his arms around her waist without saying a word. Lisa rested a hand on his head and stared at the wall where the initials were carved, the grooves catching faint light. She could still hear her sister's words, sharp as ever, but she refused to let them take root. The trailer might have been mocked, condemned, dismissed, but it was hers. And whatever secrets it had buried in its walls, she was determined to find them, no matter how many voices told her to walk away. Lisa waited until the children were asleep before she returned to the ledger. It sat on the small counter beneath the cracked window, its worn leather cover darkened by years of dampness. The trailer was quiet except for the occasional drip of rain, seeping to the patched roof, and the steady hum of the highway in the distance. She pulled a chair close and opened the book, careful not to tear its fragile pages. The handwriting was neat but hurried, rows of names and numbers arranged in columns that didn't behave like ordinary bills or grocery lists. At first glance, the figures seemed random. Some names had neat sums beside them, 50, 75, 100, while others were followed by long sequences, dates mixed with dollar signs, and strange markings that looked like shorthand. Lisa traced her finger along the margins, where tiny arrows and circles linked one name to another. It wasn't the way anyone would keep household accounts. These were transactions, records of something deliberate. She turned the page and found another set of entries, this time with initials instead of full names. Beside them were notes like South Mill River Road and Plant. The same locations repeated across multiple pages, paired with varying amounts. Lisa frowned, trying to piece them together. They looked like drop points, though she hated to admit the word even to herself. Some entries had check marks, while others were crossed out entirely. One line in particular caught her attention. R. Kessler, for crates, /$200, cleared. Her pulse quickened as she read further. The pattern became clearer. The ledger wasn't a list of debts or personal expenses. It was a record of movements, items moving through certain places, payments changing hands, and confirmation of completion. Whoever had kept these notes wasn't tracking groceries or rent. They were mapping out a network. The initials on the wall came back to her mind. GR 1978. Gerald Rowe. She imagined him sitting at the same counter decades earlier, hunched over the book, scribbling quickly before hiding it away. The missing worker from the textile plant, the man whose car had been abandoned by the river. He hadn't just vanished without reason. He had been involved in something structured, something that had routes and payments and codes. Lisa leaned back, rubbing her eyes. She thought of Marisol's scornful words, her insistence that the trailer was nothing more than rot. What would her sister say if she knew the walls had held a ledger of hidden transactions, preserved like a fossil no one was meant to find? She flipped to the final pages, which grew more cryptic. Instead of names, there were symbols, triangles, slashes, and letters that repeated in strange sequences. Some entries had stars beside them, as if to mark importance. Others were smudged, perhaps on purpose, leaving only fragments of meaning. One stood out, written in darker ink, delivery secured. Brotherhood, ***. The word made her pause. Brotherhood. It wasn't just a casual term. It looked like a proper name, something significant. She had seen it before, in stories whispered online about caches of money and hidden societies that operated in shadows. Could Gerald Rowe have been part of that? Was the trailer more than just a home for a struggling family in the late 70s? Lisa closed the ledger halfway, her hand resting on its cracked cover. The numbers didn't add up because they weren't meant to. They weren't personal accounts. They were the record of an operation carefully concealed in plain sight. She looked toward the wall where Ava had uncovered the carved initials, then to the photograph of the Rowe family. The faces stared back at her, silent, as if daring her to continue. She sat there a long time, the trailer creaking around her, the pages of the ledger whispering with secrets that had survived decades in the dark. For the first time since buying the place, Lisa felt both a chill of fear and a flicker of purpose. The trailer wasn't simply a ruin she was fighting to salvage. It was a vault of stories and transactions someone had wanted buried. And now those numbers, those routes, and those names belonged to her. The stove had been rusted to its frame, the enamel chipped and stained from years of neglect. Every time Lisa tried to cook something simple for the children, the burners hissed unevenly, as though the old appliance resented being forced back into use. After weeks of scraping by with portable hot plates, she finally decided it had to go. The work was grimy and exhausting, but it kept her mind steady. With Mateo at school and Ava grudgingly helping to hold the flashlight, Lisa braced herself against the counter and tugged the stove forward. The metal feet scraped across the warped linoleum, leaving long scratches in its wake. The smell hit her first. Stale grease mixed with dust and the faint odor of mildew that had seeped into every corner of the trailer. Behind the stove, cobwebs stretched like forgotten curtains, catching the beam of Ava's phone light. Lisa coughed and pulled the appliance farther until it cleared the space, revealing the bare wall and insulation crumbling around the edges. She expected to see nothing but filth, but something caught her eye. A corner of paper, discolored with age, wedged between the insulation and the frame. She froze, her gloved hand hovering before she pulled it free. It was stiff, brittle to the touch, folded into a neat square though its edges had yellowed and curled. She set it gently on the counter, brushing away the debris clinging to it. Ava leaned closer, her expression shifting from boredom to reluctant intrigue. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low, as though speaking too loud might cause it to crumble. Lisa unfolded the paper carefully, the old fibers crackling with each movement. What spread before them was more than just a scrap. It was a diagram. Thin lines stretched across the page, forming a grid that intersected with curves that looked like roads. Certain points were marked with circles, others with X's, and faded handwriting labeled each in quick strokes. Some names she recognized: River Road, South Mill, Plant, the same ones that had appeared in the ledger. Her pulse quickened. This was not random. It was a map, a companion to the ledger's cryptic notes. She tilted the paper toward the light, squinting at the faint lines that led away from the trailer park itself. At the top, near one corner, someone had written a single word in capital letters: Drops. Ava frowned, pointing to one of the X's near the center. "That's close to here, isn't it? Like near the bridge?" Lisa nodded slowly. She knew the area well. The bridge by the river where Gerald Rowe's abandoned car had been found in 1979. The realization made her throat tighten. The map wasn't just an idle sketch. It had been meant to guide, to record movements tied to the same hidden network Rowe had been part of. A chill crept into the room, though the heater hummed weakly in the corner. Lisa imagined Rowe standing where she was, sliding the folded map into the wall before pushing the stove back against it. Had he known he wouldn't return to retrieve it? Or had he hidden it quickly, certain he would come back? She laid the map beside the ledger on the counter. The two pieces seemed to belong together, each filling gaps the other left open. The names and numbers in the book suddenly had places to anchor themselves, routes that led across the county, paths that might still exist if anyone cared to trace them. Ava crossed her arms, her eyes sharp. "Mom, this isn't just history. It feels dangerous. What if the people who use this stuff are still around? What if someone's looking for it?" Lisa didn't answer right away. She stared at the diagram, at the faint pencil marks that had survived decades pressed into insulation. The same thought had occurred to her, heavy and unwelcome. But she also felt something else, a stubborn pull, the same feeling that had driven her to bid at the auction despite the ridicule. This trailer, mocked and abandoned, had chosen her in some way. Its walls were speaking, and she couldn't ignore them. She folded the map carefully and slid it back into the ledger, as though reuniting two halves of the same secret. Then she looked at Ava, her voice steady. "If someone hid this here, it was meant to be found by someone like us. We'll be careful, but we won't pretend it doesn't matter." The stove sat forgotten in the middle of the room, its rusted frame catching shadows as the sun slipped lower. The real discovery wasn't the appliance's removal, but the map it had concealed, a fragile sheet of paper that carried the outline of something larger than the walls of the trailer. Lisa placed her hand on the ledger, the map tucked inside, and felt again the faint tremor of history pressing against her own choices. The trailer was no longer just shelter. It was becoming a story, piece by piece, and she was already too deep to turn away. The air in Meadowbrook Park carried a faint smell of cut grass mixed with gasoline, the sort of Saturday morning scent that came from neighbors tuning up old lawnmowers and trying to keep their lots respectable. Lisa had been outside patching a section of skirting beneath the trailer when she noticed an older man lingering by the fence. He leaned on a cane carved from hickory, his shoulders stooped, his bald cap bleached pale from years of sun. He watched her for a while before speaking, his voice thin but clear. "You're the one who bought Rowe's place." Lisa set down her hammer, brushing dirt from her palms. "Row." The man nodded, squinting across the lot as though seeing something overlaid with memory. Gerald Rowe. Lived there with his wife and 2 kids. Long time back. Her pulse quickened at the name, but she forced her expression to stay neutral. "I found some things inside. Old belongings. A photograph. Was he here long?" The neighbor shifted his weight, his cane tapping lightly against the gravel. "Few years. Moving around 75, 76. Kept mostly to himself. Folks around here said he was polite but quiet, always writing things down." Lisa's gaze drifted toward the trailer, its rusted siding and sagging porch. She imagined a man at the counter where she now kept a ledger, scribbling late at night by the weak light of a lamp. "Writing what?" she asked. The old man shrugged, but his eyes narrowed with the effort of memory. "Not letters. Not the kind you send. Little notebooks, always full of numbers. Saw him at the laundromat once. Pulled one out of his pocket and kept scribbling while the machines ran. Asked him what it was for, and he just smiled. Said it was work. Never explained more." Lisa felt the ledger's weight, even though it was inside, hidden in a drawer. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Did anyone think it strange?" The man chuckled dryly, the sound more weary than amused. Everything was strange in those days. Factory jobs were steady but rough. Plenty of men kept side work, odd deals to make ends meet. Gerald, though, he wasn't the type for noise or drinking. Always seemed to carry something on his shoulders, like he knew more than he could say. He paused, looking down at his cane before continuing. Then one summer night, he just disappeared. Folks whispered plenty. Some said he ran off with money. Others said the river took him. But his wife, the man's voice softened. She always swore he wouldn't leave on his own. Said he was trying to do right by them, and someone didn't like it. Lisa folded her arms, fighting the chill that crept into her despite the warmth of the morning. Did his family stay here long after? The old man shook his head. Not long. A year maybe. They left most everything behind. Never said goodbye proper. It was like they packed in the middle of the night. After that, this place sat quiet. People tried renting it once or twice, but they never stayed. Silence hung between them, filled by the distant buzz of a mower starting down the row. The neighbor finally tipped his cap and began to move on, his cane striking rhythm against the pavement. Before he left earshot, he called back over his shoulder. Gerald was a good man, just quiet, always writing things down. Whatever he left in those walls, maybe it'll tell you the rest. Lisa stood by the porch, her tools forgotten, watching the man's figure shrink along the row of trailers. His words wrapped themselves around the image she carried of Gerald Rowe, a quiet factory worker, bent over notebooks filled with numbers no one else understood. She thought of the initials carved into the frame, the ledger with its cryptic columns, the map folded behind the stove. Pieces of a story were emerging, and now she knew it wasn't simply curiosity pulling her deeper. It was the echo of someone who had lived here before, leaving behind his silence and writing, waiting for someone willing to listen. The afternoon was warm enough that the air inside the trailer felt heavy, pressing down on every movement. Lisa had been sorting through one of the boxes they'd pulled from the closet when she heard the sharp sound of linoleum tearing. She looked up quickly and saw Ava crouched on the kitchen floor, her hands tugging at a corner where the old flooring had already begun to curl. "Don't pull that up," Lisa warned, though her voice lacked conviction. Ava ignored her, slipping her fingers beneath the brittle sheet and peeling it back with deliberate force. The adhesive cracked and popped as the linoleum curled upward, revealing the dark plywood underneath. Dust puffed into the air, catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the grimy window. Mateo, who had been building a small fort out of the cracked dishes in the living room, scrambled closer to watch. At first, it looked like nothing more than stains from water damage, dark patches that spread unevenly across the floorboards. But as Ava pulled the sheet back farther, a distinct color emerged, faint but unmistakable. A reddish mark bled across the grain of the wood. Its edges blurred, but its center deep, as though something had seeped into fibers long ago. Ava froze, her hand hovering above the exposed patch. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual defiance. "Look at this." Lisa knelt beside her, her breath catching in her throat. The stain stretched in an uneven oval, no larger than a dinner plate, darker in the middle and lighter toward the edges. She reached out, pressing her fingertips gently against it. The wood was smooth with age, the stain sunken deep, as if the years had tried but failed to erase it. Mateo's eyes widened. "Is that blood?" he whispered. Lisa hesitated, forcing herself not to answer too quickly. "It could be anything," she said, though her voice wavered. "Rust from a pipe, maybe paint that spilled." Ava shook her head, her expression grim. "Pain doesn't look like that. And why would anyone spill paint in the middle of the kitchen and not clean it up?" Silence settled in, broken only by the creak of the trailer adjusting to the afternoon heat. Lisa's mind raced back to the stories the elderly neighbor had told her about Gerald Rowe vanishing without explanation, about his wife and children leaving suddenly in the night. She thought of the ledger with its cryptic columns, the map hidden behind the stove, the initials carved into the frame. Now here was something physical, stark and unsettling, buried beneath the floor like a scar the trailer itself refused to forget. She forced herself to pull the linoleum back farther. The stain stretched longer than she first thought, spreading toward the wall in streaks, as though whatever it caused had dripped or been dragged. Her stomach tightened, and she quickly let the sheet fall back into place. The sound of it slapping against the floor startled her children, who both looked at her with wide eyes. "Don't jump to conclusions," she said firmly, though the words were more for herself than for them. "We don't know what it is." Ava sat back on her heels, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You think he disappeared because he wanted to, but what if something happened to him here?" Lisa looked at the stain one more time before standing, brushing the dust from her palms. She didn't answer. Some questions carried more weight when left unspoken, and the trailer seemed to know it. The red mark in the wood had survived decades, hidden beneath the linoleum, silent but insistent. It didn't matter whether it was blood or something else. It had the power to make them wonder, to make them afraid. She gathered the children and told them it was time to eat, though none of them were hungry. As she ladled soup into bowls, her eyes kept drifting back to the floor. The reddish mark remained hidden beneath the curling edge of linoleum, but she could still see it clearly in her mind. It was another fragment of the story pressing itself into her life. Another reminder that the walls and floors of this trailer were not empty. They had witnessed something, absorbed it, and carried it forward, waiting for a family to uncover what others had chosen to forget. The night was quiet except for the steady tick of rain dripping into a bucket near the couch. Lisa lay awake on the floor beside her children, her body stiff on the hard surface and her mind refusing to rest. The trailer's thin walls seemed to magnify every sound, the groan of the wind against the siding, the occasional scurry of mice inside the cabinets, the faint whistle of air slipping through the cracks in the windows. She told herself these noises were ordinary, the natural chorus of a place left to decay for decades. But then came something different. It started with a single creak, sharp and deliberate, as though someone had stepped onto one of the weak boards in the narrow hallway. Lisa lifted her head, listening. For a moment there was nothing, only the familiar dripping. She exhaled slowly, telling herself it was just the trailer settling, the wood shifting with the night air. But then it came again, another groan, heavier this time, followed by a faint rustle as though fabric had brushed against the wall. She pushed herself upright, careful not to wake Mateo, who had curled against her side in sleep. Ava stirred slightly, opening one eye before closing again, muttering that she was cold. Lisa rose quietly, her bare feet brushing against the rough carpet. She held her breath as she moved toward the hallway, every muscle tense, her ears straining for the next sound. The trailer was dark, only the weak glow of a streetlight outside slipping through the blinds. The hall stretched ahead of her, lined with doors to the bathroom and two small bedrooms they hadn't begun to repair. She stood still, waiting, and there it was again, a creak, slow and deliberate, as if someone was testing their weight with caution. Lisa's throat tightened. It didn't sound like the random groan of wood. It sounded like footsteps. She whispered into the dark, "Is someone there?" Her voice seemed to dissolve in the silence that followed. She waited, but no answer came, only the faint hum of the old refrigerator, Struggling to stay alive, she forced herself to step forward, her hand brushing the wall for balance. The floor beneath her feet was uneven, but she had grown used to where it gave and where it held. Tonight the groans came from places she wasn't standing. Lisa opened the door to the first bedroom. The air smelled of mold and dust. Her eyes swept across the small space, catching only shapes of abandoned furniture and broken blinds. Nothing moved. She closed it quietly and stepped to the next door, heart pounding. Again, the room was empty, but as she turned back into the hall, she swore she heard another sound, the faintest click, as though something metallic had been set down on wood. She returned to the living room, unsettled, and sat near her children until her heartbeat slowed. Mateo stirred, sensing her movement, and murmured, "What's wrong, Mom?" She stroked his hair and told him it was nothing, just the trailer making noise. But her own words carried no weight. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been there, someone searching for the same secrets she had begun to uncover. The ledger on the counter seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its cracked leather cover catching the reflection of the street lamp. She rose and tucked it into a drawer, then slid the map alongside it, her hand shaking slightly as she closed the wood with more force than intended. Whatever Gerald Rowe had left behind, she wasn't the only one who knew it was here. The trailer had creaked under weight that wasn't hers, and the silence afterward felt too calculated, as though whoever, or whatever it was, had chosen not to be found. She lay down again beside her children, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. Every sound pressed sharper now, every drip, every sigh of the wind, each creak in the boards. Sleep came only in fragments, shallow and restless. And through it all, Lisa couldn't escape the thought that Gerald's secrets were stirring something larger than memory, something that still had eyes on the trailer, waiting for the moment to step fully into the open. Lisa sat at the small kitchen table, the ledger open before her, the faint lines of ink stretched like veins across the brittle paper. The names and numbers had been haunting her for days, and the word plant appeared often enough that she could no longer ignore it. She thought back to the old newspaper clippings she had photocopied at the library, the ones that had first given Gerald Rowe a name and a face. The Whitaker textile plant. It was there in black and white, his place of employment, the last place he had been seen before vanishing into the silence of 1979. She returned to the library the next morning, the same hum of fluorescent lights above, and the smell of dust clinging to the stacks. The librarian gave her a polite nod, but didn't ask questions this time. Lisa went straight for the microfilm reels, fingers clumsy but determined as she loaded them into machine. Frame by frame, the years of the late 70s scrolled past her eyes, headlines about union strikes, factory layoffs, and the slow decline of a once thriving industry. Then she found it. A headline from 1977 read, "Textile plant under investigation for missing inventory." Her eyes widened as she leaned closer. The article was short but sharp, noting discrepancies in shipping records, bales of fabric listed as sent but never arriving, trucks leaving the warehouse with less weight than they should have carried. The piece hinted at possible diversion of goods, but stopped short of naming names. Officials had apparently brushed it aside after a few months, blaming errors in bookkeeping and poor oversight. But Lisa knew better. She thought of the ledger's columns, the initials and coded markings that didn't behave like simple accounts. And she thought of the map, with its marked routes and the word drops written in the corner. This wasn't just sloppy accounting. It was smuggling, hidden within the daily routines of factory work. Shipments disguised as ordinary textile deliveries. She pressed further through the reels, finding small follow-ups buried in later issues. In 1978, a local journalist had written about rumors of contraband moving through the county, hidden among shipments from the very same plant. Cigarettes, liquor, even jewelry were mentioned, though the article admitted evidence was scarce. There was talk of a circle of workers who kept silent, who moved things at night through side routes only they knew. The piece ended abruptly, noting that the journalist's sources had gone quiet. Lisa copied the articles, folding the thin paper into her bag. On the drive back to the trailer, her mind kept circling the same thought. Gerald hadn't just been a quiet man scribbling in notebooks. He had been a recorder, someone who kept track of the movement others wanted to blur. Perhaps he had been trusted, Or perhaps he had taken it upon himself to write it down, a witness hiding evidence in the walls of his own home. When she returned, Ava and Mateo were outside, kicking a ball along the gravel path. Lisa slipped into the trailer and laid the new clippings beside the ledger. Together they painted a picture that unsettled her deeply. The plant was not just an employer. It had been a cover for something larger, a network of smuggling that depended on silence and secrecy. Gerald's disappearance in 1979 now seemed less like an accident and more like the inevitable end of a man who had seen too much or written down what others wanted forgotten. She sat for a long time at the table, her hand resting on the ledger. The children's voices drifted into the open window, carefree and light, untouched by the shadows she was uncovering. Lisa knew she could close the drawer, tuck the ledger and map away, and pretend this history had nothing to do with her. But she couldn't. The factory connection was too strong, too precise. The trailer wasn't just a ruin she bought for $300. It was tied to a story of smuggling, secrecy, and a man who had vanished because he carried the truth too openly in his quiet, scribbling hands. The walls seemed to hum with that silence now, and Lisa felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Gerald had worked at a plant everyone thought of as ordinary, a place that made shirts and dresses for stores across the state. But beneath the surface, it had been something else, and the proof was spread before her in ink and brittle paper. She wondered how far the threads reached and whether anyone else still cared enough to pull at them. The discovery came on a quiet afternoon, when the air inside the trailer was thick with the smell of dust and the faint sweetness of damp insulation. Lisa had stepped outside to speak with the park manager about a leaking pipe near the lot, leaving Ava to keep an eye on her brother. Mateo, restless as always, decided to pry further into the section of wall they had opened days earlier. He crouched low, his small hands tugging at the frayed insulation that bulged between the studs. At first, it gave him nothing but gray fluff and splinters. Then his fingers brushed against something stiff and flat. He pulled it out carefully, sneezing as particles of dust filled the air. The paper was thin and yellowed, folded several times until it fit snugly within the wall. Its edges were fragile, threatening to tear with the slightest tug. Mateo unfolded it slowly, his excitement rising with each crease he smoothed away. Across the surface, in faded ink, were more of the same careful strokes they had seen in the ledger. Words marched down the page in cramped handwriting, deliveries secured. Ava leaned over his shoulder, the glow from her phone lighting the faded ink. "Mom's not going to be happy if you break the wall more," she muttered, though her eyes were already fixed on the writing. The list that followed was short but precise. Names reduced to initials, dates paired with routes, and small notes that echoed the ledger's cryptic style. One line read, J.Ardit, South Mill, cleared. Another, TW River Road. 2 crates. Each entry was followed by the same word, secured. Mateo's eyes widened. "It's another page," he whispered, as though afraid the walls themselves might hear. Like the book. When Lisa returned, she found her children crouched on the floor, the slip of paper spread carefully between them. Her heart leapt into her throat. She knelt down, her gloved hands trembling as she picked it up. The ink was fainter than in the ledger, as though it had been written in haste with a dying pen. But the handwriting was the same. Gerald Rowe's hand, no doubt, repeating his meticulous records on a loose page. Lisa studied it carefully. The initials didn't mean much to her, but the places were familiar. South Mill River Road plant. The same sites marked on the folded map she had found behind the stove. The pattern was undeniable now. This page had not been meant for a household memory. It had been meant for tracking something far larger, a system of movements that relied on secrecy. The repetition of secured made her chest tighten. These were confirmations, perhaps signals that whatever was being moved had arrived safely. Ava broke the silence. Why would he hide just one page in the wall if he already had a whole book? Lisa looked down at her daughter, uncertain how much of the truth to give. Maybe he didn't have time. Maybe he wanted to make sure a copy stayed here if the rest was taken. She thought of Gerald's disappearance, of the rumors of smuggling tied to the textile plant. Perhaps this slip of paper had been a backup, a fragment he had tucked away when he felt the walls closing in around him. The ledger could be carried off, but this page, hidden deep in insulation, was harder to find. Mateo leaned against her arm, his voice hushed. "Do you think he knew something bad was coming?" Lisa folded the page carefully, slipping it into the ledger where it seemed to belong. "Maybe he did," she said softly. "Or maybe he was just careful. Either way, he wanted it remembered." She rose slowly, the fragile document pressed against her chest. The children watched as she placed it back on the counter beside the ledger and the map, the pieces of Gerald's story gathering like puzzle fragments. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trailer's loose siding. Lisa felt the tremor of unease crawl back through her, the memory of footsteps in the night still fresh. Someone else could be searching for these same fragments. Someone who knew what the word secured truly meant. The trailer was no longer just a place of shelter or even of history. It was becoming a vault, a fragile keeper of records that pointed to a hidden trade. Each discovery drew them closer to a truth that had swallowed Gerald Rojo, and now Lisa could not help but wonder if uncovering it would place her family on the same path. Still, she did not tuck the slip away in fear. She left it out, beside the ledger and the map, a small testament to the fact that the walls had finally given up another piece of what they had guarded for nearly half a century. The first time Lisa noticed it, she thought little of it. A dark sedan, older but well-maintained, rolled slowly down a row of trailers one evening just as the sun dipped behind the trees. Its headlights caught the rust along her own trailer siding, the brief glare filling the windows before it pulled into a space 2 lots down. She assumed it belonged to a visitor, maybe a relative of one of the neighbors. But when she woke in the middle of the night for a glass of water, she saw its outline again through the slats of the blinds. It sat parked under the dim glow of a streetlight, its engine off, windows dark, as though waiting for something. By morning, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but tire marks pressed faintly into the gravel. Lisa told herself not to dwell on it, that people came and went in a trailer park all the time. But then it appeared again 2 nights later, idling at the far corner of the lot before easing into the same space. This time, Ava noticed it too. She was brushing her teeth at the small bathroom sink when she peered out the narrow window and whispered urgently for her mother. Lisa joined her, both of them crouching to keep their figures hidden behind the thin curtains. The sedan was there, silent and still, a shadow at the edge of their world. No one got out. No one walked nearby. It simply remained, as if its presence alone was meant to be noticed. Mateo was restless that night, asking why his mother and sister whispered in the dark. Lisa told him it was nothing, just a car that didn't belong. But even as she said it, she felt the hollowness in her words. The image of the ledger, the map, and the slip of paper with the word secured ran through her mind. She thought of the footsteps she had heard in the hallway only nights before, and the way the old neighbor had said Gerald always carried something heavy on his shoulders. Now she wondered if those weights had followed him into disappearance, and were circling her family too. Days passed, and the sedan became part of the landscape. It didn't come every night, but often enough to unsettle her. Once she caught sight of a figure inside, the faint glow of a cigarette ember flaring near the driver's seat. Another time, she thought she saw the silhouette of a man leaning slightly against the wheel, watching the row of trailers with a stillness too deliberate to be casual. Each time she tried to convince herself it was coincidence, some lover's quarrel, or someone too ashamed to drive home after a long night. But the timing gnawed at her. The car always came late, after most of the park had gone to bed, and it always left before dawn. Lisa began double-checking the locks, pushing old chairs against the doors, and keeping the ledger and papers hidden deeper each night. Ava grew more restless, her teenage defiance sharpening into suspicion. "They're watching us," she said one evening, her voice flat. "They know what we found." Mateo clung closer to Lisa, refusing to sleep in his own corner of the trailer, his small body trembling whenever headlights passed outside. Lisa tried to reassure them, but each time she heard the crunch of gravel at odd hours, her stomach knotted. She had bought the trailer to claim a piece of stability, to prove to herself and her children that they could build something out of nothing. But now shadows lingered at the edge of that fragile hope. The sedan was a reminder that secrets buried in walls never stayed hidden forever. Someone was circling, patient, waiting, just as Gerald Rowe had once scribbled into his notebooks, only for silence to swallow him whole. On the 4th night, when she again saw the sedan parked under the weak light. Lisa stood longer at the window than before. Her hand rested on the curtain, her eyes fixed on the unmoving shadow. She didn't know whether to fear it more if it stayed, or if it one day disappeared entirely, leaving her to wonder where it might turn up next. The park office sat at the far end of the row, a squat building with peeling paint and blinds that never seemed straight in the windows. Lisa had been avoiding it for weeks, choosing instead to slip rent payments through the slot in the door rather than deal with the man who ran the place. But after another night of seeing the sedan idle beneath the streetlight, and after Ava whispered that she didn't feel safe walking to the bus stop alone, Lisa decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. She marched across the gravel with the ledger tucked inside her bag, as if carrying it with her could give her a sense of control. The park manager, Mr. Harlan, was waiting behind the counter when she stepped inside. He was a thick-set man in his late 50s, with a permanent scowl carved into his face and a posture that suggested he'd long since given up trying to stand straight. His eyes flicked up from a stack of papers as she entered, narrowing slightly. "You Moreno?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Lisa nodded. "I'm in 14. At that, his expression shifted, not quite surprise, but something closer to resignation. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. 14, he repeated, as if the number itself carried weight. Should have known. Lisa frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, his fingers drumming on the counter. Trailer 14 always brings trouble. Been that way since Roe lived there. Should have torn it down years ago. Her chest tightened. Trouble how? Harlan leaned forward, lowering his voice though no one else was in the office. Roe worked at that textile plant. Nice enough guy. Kept his head down, but people said he was mixed up in things he shouldn't have been. After he disappeared, his wife tried to stick it out. Didn't last. Then the tenants that came after, they never stayed long. Break-ins, fights. Folks saying they heard things at night. Always ended the same. People packing up in the dark, leaving deposits behind just to get out. 14 doesn't hold families. It spits them out. Lisa felt the blood rush in her ears, but she kept her face composed. So you're saying what? That I should walk away? That my kids and I don't belong here? Harlan gave a humorless chuckle. I'm saying that place has a history, and history's got a way of clinging. You want my advice? You'd sell it back before it drags you down with it. I won't stop you if you stay, but don't come crying when the bad luck catches up. 14's got a way of drawing eyes. Her thoughts flicked instantly to the dark sedan, to the slip of paper marked deliveries secured, to the red stain beneath the linoleum. The pieces clicked together in a way that chilled her. There's already someone watching, she said quietly. Harlan's eyes sharpened. Then you'd better be careful. People don't park out there at night for no reason. He straightened the papers on his desk as if dismissing her. You want to keep on digging, that's your business. But don't say you weren't warned. Lisa left the office with the sound of his words following her like a shadow. Trailer 14 always brings trouble. The phrase looped in her mind as she crossed the lot back toward her home, where Ava and Mateo waited on the steps. Their faces lifted with relief when they saw her, but Lisa couldn't bring herself to return the smile. She glanced down the row, her eyes landing on the empty space beneath the streetlight where the sedan had been the night before. The gravel was smooth again, as though the car had never been there, but the memory of its presence pressed heavy on her. She put a hand on Mateo's shoulder and guided her children inside. For the first time since signing those papers with shaking hands, she felt the weight of the trailer's history settle onto her fully. Not as a burden she chose, but as a mantle forced upon her. Trouble had lived here before, and now it seemed it was circling back. The wall gave way with less effort than Lisa expected. The paneling near the bedroom corner had long since rotted, its edges soft, the nails rusted to the point of breaking under the claw of her hammer. She peeled it back, careful not to startle Mateo, who sat nearby with a comic book, and not to draw Ava's impatient sighs from the kitchen. Dust rained down in a thin shower, coating her sleeves. For a moment she saw only the stuffing of old insulation, gray and torn. But tucked between the beams, bound with brittle string, was a narrow bundle of envelopes. Her breath caught as she pulled them free. The stack light in her hands, but weighted with time. Each envelope was yellowed, corners bent, the paper inside stiff and unyielding. She brushed away grit and studied the handwriting. Gerald Rowe's name appeared on the return address. Each loop of his cursive deliberate, written in a hand that suggested he was in no hurry, except perhaps for what was written within. The recipients varied. Some bore names she didn't recognize. Others were addressed to the county office, one even to the local paper. But none carried a postage stamp. None had ever been sent. Lisa slit open the first with a trembling finger. The ink inside had bled faintly, but the words were still clear. Asterisk, I cannot stay silent. If anything happens, know that it was not an accident. Asterisk, her skin prickled as she read. The letter went on to describe shipments from the textile plant that did not match their records, trucks leaving loaded with more than fabric. Gerald hinted at threats made against him, warning that his family could be at risk if he spoke. The last line was darker still. If they come for me, the truth is here. Lisa set it down, her fingers unsteady, and opened another. This one was addressed to a man named Charles Henson, whom she did not know. The words within spoke of betrayal. Gerald accused him of falsifying documents, of working with men outside the plant to funnel goods. He begged for him to stop, pleaded that they both had families, that the danger was greater than profit. The letter was never sent. A third envelope carried no address at all. The words inside seemed written for no one and everyone at once. Asterisk, they think silence keeps them safe, but silence only buries the truth deeper. I am afraid of what they will do, but I am more afraid of being forgotten. If these words are found, remember that I tried. Asterisk. Lisa pressed a bundle to her chest, her mind racing. Gerald had not vanished by chance. He had seen too much, known too much, and perhaps trusted the wrong people. His fear was written in every line, yet so was his determination. The ledger, the map, the slip of paper marked secured. They were records of a network. These letters, however, were his confession, his attempt to preserve his voice in case it was silenced. Ava appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing. "What is it this time?" she asked, but her tone carried more worry than sarcasm. Lisa handed her one of the envelopes. "Letters," she said simply. "He wrote them, but he never sent them." Ava read in silence, her lips tightening as she scanned the words. Mateo abandoned his comic and moved closer, peering at the faded ink with wide eyes. The three of them sat together in the dim light of the trailer, bound by the same unease. Gerald's words had survived the years, and now they lay in their hands like fragile evidence of a story the world had chosen to forget. Lisa placed the letters beside the ledger, aligning them carefully as though they belonged together. Each discovery deepened the shadows of Trailer 14, but also carved out a new sense of duty within her. Gerald Rowe had written in no one, but his words had finally reached someone. And now, whether she wanted to or not, Lisa had become the keeper of his unfinished testimony. The closet in the smallest bedroom had always seemed wrong to Lisa. Its frame sat uneven against the wall, and the back panel bowed in a way that suggested it had been hastily nailed rather than properly built. She had ignored it at first, focusing instead on patching leaks and scrubbing years of grime from the counters. But after finding Gerald's ledger, the map, the slip of paper, and now the unsent letters, she could no longer look at that crooked wall without suspicion. One evening, while Ava sulked over homework at the table and Mateo played on the worn carpet, Lisa fetched her tools. She pulled open the closet door, its hinges squealing, and knelt inside. The smell of old wood and mildew clung to the narrow space. Her fingers traced the seam along the back panel, finding gaps where the nails had rusted loose. The wood flexed slightly when she pressed it, the sound hollow. Her pulse quickened. "It's not solid," she whispered, though no one was near enough to hear. She wedged the claw of her hammer into the seam and pried carefully. The board resisted at first, creaking like it didn't want to give up its secret, then cracked free with a sharp pop. Dust clouded the air, and Ava came to the doorway, frowning. "What now?" her daughter asked, though curiosity softened her voice. Lisa pulled the panel aside, revealing a shallow cavity between the studs. At first it looked empty, just shadows and insulation. But then her eyes caught the dull glint of metal stacked neatly in the dark. She reached in, her hands brushing cold tin. One box, then another and another. By the time she had pulled them all into the open, 6 small containers sat on the closet floor, their lids sealed tight with tape that had yellowed but still held fast. Mateo appeared, wide-eyed. "Treasure," he breathed, his voice full of awe. Lisa didn't answer right away. She turned the first box over in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, the weight shifting slightly inside as though it held something solid. No markings gave away its contents, just tin, dulled with time. She tried prying at the edge of the lid, but the tape clung stubbornly. Ava crouched beside her, running her finger along one of the boxes. "Why would he hide these?" she asked quietly. Lisa thought of the letters written to no one, of Gerald's careful records, and the fear threaded into every page. These boxes had been meant to stay hidden, sealed away where only someone desperate or determined enough would find them. She imagined Gerald late at night, sliding the panel into place, hands shaking as he tucked away each box. Did he plan to return for them, or did he know he never would? She stacked them neatly, her heart hammering, the sight of them both thrilling and terrifying. The ledger had been words, the map had been lines, the letters had been confessions. But these boxes, whatever they contained, were physical, tangible, undeniable. They weren't just records of something. They were something, proof, evidence, perhaps even the very cargo he had written about in his notes. Ava's eyes locked on her mother's. "We're going to open them, right?" Lisa nodded slowly, though dread pooled in her stomach. "Not yet," she murmured. "We need to be careful. Whatever's inside, it was hidden for a reason." The children lingered as Lisa slid the boxes back into the cavity, arranging them exactly as she had found them. She replaced the panel loosely, leaving just enough room to retrieve them again. For now, they would remain in their hollow hiding place, as silent as the years they had already endured. That night, as she lay awake listening to the creaks of the trailer and the faint hum of cars passing on the highway, her thoughts circled back to the weight of those tins. 6 boxes, sealed and silent, resting behind a false wall that had protected them for decades. Lisa had stumbled onto Gerald's hidden world piece by piece. But this discovery was different. The ledger, the map, the letters, they could still be dismissed as stories, as speculation. But 10 boxes carried weight. 10 boxes demanded answers. And now, somewhere beyond the dark windows of Trailer 14, she could not shake the sense that someone else was waiting for those answers too. The following afternoon, Lisa gathered the boxes onto the kitchen table. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, striping the tins in pale lines of gold and shadow. Ava leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, pretending disinterest, though her eyes kept flicking toward the stack. Mateo sat on his knees in a chair, his chin just clearing the tabletop, too excited to hide it. The air felt heavy, as though the trailer itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would finally be revealed. Lisa picked up the first box, the tape stiff and flaking under her fingers. She slid a paring knife carefully beneath the edge, working it slowly so as not to tear the brittle metal. With a soft rip, the seal gave way, and the lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were stacks of folded documents. She lifted one free and smoothed it on the table. The faded heading read Certificate of Stock, issued to Gerald Rowe by a company she didn't recognize, Whitmore Shipping and Trade, Incorporated. Ava stepped closer. "Is that money?" Lisa shook her head. "Not exactly. These are shares. They're ownership papers. Or at least they were once." She flipped through more, each one stamped with dates from the 1960s and 70s. Some were marked with embossed seals. Others bore signatures of company officers long forgotten. The second box revealed much the same, but with different names. Harper Textile Mills, Green River Lumber Company, Westland Freight, ***, each certificate looked official. Yet all the names rang faint bells in Lisa's memory, tied not to current businesses, but to articles she'd seen about shuttered factories and bankrupt firms. She pulled another sheet from the pile, her hand trembling slightly. It was a deed, ownership of a small parcel of land near the old rail spur outside town. Mateo tilted his head. Why would anyone hide papers? Lisa didn't answer right away. She turned the deed over, noting the notary's mark and the name signed at the bottom. It wasn't Gerald's. It belonged to someone else entirely, a name she didn't recognize. The realization prickled her skin. These weren't his personal belongings. They were records of assets, scattered pieces of vanished companies in forgotten land, bundled together and sealed away. By the time she opened the fourth and fifth boxes, the table was crowded with yellowed certificates and folded deeds. Some bore faint stains. Others still smelled faintly of mildew from their years behind the wall. Together they painted a strange picture, one of value, but not in a form anyone could easily spend. Many of the companies were long defunct, their names tied to stories of closures, bankruptcies, even scandals. But Lisa sensed there was something more beneath the surface. These weren't random scraps. They had been gathered with purpose. Ava ran her fingers along a stack of bonds, the edges crisp despite their age. Could they be worth anything? Lisa hesitated. Maybe not on their own. Most of these companies don't exist anymore. But sometimes value isn't in what the papers mean today. It's in what they prove. They tie people together. They show who owned what, when, and how much. She thought of Gerald's ledger, the routes and payments that suggested smuggling through the textile plant. She thought of the letters, where he had written of betrayal and threats. Perhaps these documents were his shield. Proof of transactions too tangled to explain away. Proof of ownership and money that had changed hands behind the veil of closed companies. The final box was the heaviest. When Lisa cut to the tape and lifted the lid, she found a bundle of bank certificates, carefully bound with twine. Some bore the insignia of institutions that had folded decades ago. Others showed deposits transferred to trusts whose names were now faint whispers in county records. Each paper felt like a key to a door no one had opened in years. Lisa leaned back in her chair, staring at the spread of documents. 6 boxes filled not with cash or jewels, but with history disguised as paper. Land deeds, bonds, stocks, record of companies that had once controlled freight, lumber, textiles, and trade. Together, they painted a portrait of a network woven deep into the county's past. Mateo broke the silence. It's like a treasure, but a boring one. Lisa smiled faintly, though her mind churned. Not boring, she said. Dangerous. She gathered the documents carefully back into their boxes, her hand steady now despite the weight of the discovery. These papers weren't forgotten junk. They were evidence of something layered and deliberate, hidden in tin to survive the years. She couldn't yet say what Gerald Rowe had planned to do with them, but she understood why he had feared betrayal, why he had written to no one, and why his trail had ended in silence. The boxes sat sealed once more on the table, but the truth they carried lingered in the air of Trailer 14, pressing closer with every hour. Lisa sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed, the ledger open before her, its pages curling at the edges like leaves about to crumble. The 10 boxes still rested nearby, stacked neatly in the hollow space of the closet, but her focus was fixed on the book that had started it all. She ran her finger down one of the columns of names, the initials first, then the fuller versions written in smaller script along the margins. Some she had already connected to addresses in the county, names she had seen in old directories at the library. But the deeper she looked, the stranger the pattern became. She pulled the notebook closer and jotted the names onto scrap paper. J. Randall, T. Bowers, C. Henson, E. Laird. Asterisk, asterisk, the list grew as she flipped through the pages, cross-referencing the ledger's neat handwriting with the articles she had copied earlier from microfilm. At first, they were ordinary men, truck drivers, warehouse clerks, shift supervisors at the textile plant, men with families, mortgages, and jobs that tied them to the rhythms of the town. But by the late 70s, their names began to vanish. She checked county tax rolls, flipping through brittle pages in the library's archive. Property once registered under their names had transferred suddenly, often sold for next to nothing, sometimes signed over without any recorded buyer at all. Old phone directories revealed their households disappearing from one year to the next. In some cases, entire families were gone without explanation, leaving behind shutter homes that soon fell into disrepair. The more Lisa pieced together, the clearer it became. Gerald hadn't only been tracking routes and payments. He had been tracing the people tied to those movements, perhaps documenting those who carried the risk alongside him. And one by one, Those names were erased from the town's fabric. Her pen paused over one entry. C. Henson, Plant, 5 shipments. She remembered the unsent letter she had found, addressed to a man of the same name. Gerald had accused him of betrayal, of falsifying records. When Lisa searched the newspapers again, she found that Charles Henson's name appeared until 1979, and then never again. No obituary, no retirement notice, no arrest, just silence. She turned the ledger to another page. T. Bowers, River Road, cleared. That name had surfaced once in a 1978 article about a car accident near the bridge. The report was vague, noting that the driver had not been identified at the scene. No follow-up was ever printed. Lisa leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight, and pressed her hands to her face. The ledger was no longer just a record of transactions. It was a record of disappearances, a quiet list of people who had either been silenced or forced to vanish. Gerald had written them down carefully, methodically, as if knowing that one day they too would be erased. The thought chilled her. If the names he tracked had disappeared, then what about him? His own initials were carved into the wood of the trailer, but he too had been swallowed whole by silence. Had he expected to join the list all along? A noise outside startled her, a crunch of gravel, faint but deliberate. She looked toward the blinds, heart racing, but saw only the faint orange glow of the streetlight and the outline of the sedan in its usual place. She pulled the ledger shut quickly, sliding it beneath the stack of envelopes Gerald had left unsent. Ava stirred in her sleep down the hall, and Lisa sat still, listening to the creaks of the trailer settling. The names lingered in her mind, not just as letters on a page, but as men whose lives had ended in gaps the town no longer cared to explain. Each had been tied to the network of smuggling. Each vanished once their usefulness or loyalty was questioned. Gerald had seen the pattern forming, and instead of silence, he had recorded it, hoping someone would understand. Now Lisa did. She stared at the closed ledger, the weight of it heavy in the drawer. Trailer 14 had not chosen her by chance. It had waited for someone willing to read the names, to notice the spaces where lives had been erased. And with that knowledge came a dread she couldn't shake. If others knew what the ledger contained, they would not want its pages read again. Lisa hadn't expected Daniel to show up without calling first. He arrived on a Saturday morning, his truck rumbling down the gravel lane and parking in front of the trailer with a forceful crunch of tires. Ava spotted him first from the window and muttered something under her breath, retreating to her room before he even knocked. Mateo, less guarded, opened the door wide, calling out Dad, with the eager relief of a child who still believed visits meant something good. Daniel stepped inside, ducking slightly under the low frame, his presence filling the narrow space with authority Lisa hadn't invited. He glanced around at the patched walls, the buckets positioned under leaks, the boxes of Gerald's papers stacked neatly on a shelf Lisa had tried to disguise as storage. His mouth pressed into a grim line. "This place," he said without even greeting her, "isn't fit for them. You know that, right?" Lisa bristled. "It's ours." "I'm fixing it." "Fixing it." He laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Lisa, this trailer's a death trap. It's falling apart. The floor sags, the roof leaks, and God knows what's in these walls. And you've got our kids living here?" Mateo looked between them, uncertain, sensing the shift in tone. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder and sent him down the hall to join his sister. Once he was gone, she squared her shoulders, meeting Daniel's glare. "It's not perfect, but it's what I could afford. $300 got us a start. It's more than I had when you left." Daniel's face darkened, but his voice stayed sharp. "This isn't about me. This is about them. They deserve better than a rotting tin box with stories about missing factory men and strange cars parked outside. Don't think I haven't heard from people around here. Trailer 14's got a reputation, and I'm not going to stand by while you drag them into whatever obsession you found in these walls." Lisa stiffened, every muscle tight. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know enough," Daniel shot back. "Ava told me about the noises at night. Mateo mentioned the car that won't leave the lot. And then there's you, digging into files, chasing after a man who disappeared 40 years ago, like it's your job. You think that's stability for them? You think it's safe? The words cut deep, but Lisa held her ground. I'm trying to build something. For once in my life, I'm not walking away. You of all people should understand what leaving costs. His jaw tightened, shame flickering across his face before anger smothered it. Don't twist his back on me. If you won't think about yourself, think about the kids. If you don't leave this place, I'll go to court. I'll make sure they don't spend another night here. The threat hung heavy between them. Lisa felt her breath catch, her chest aching with the weight of it. She wanted to scream that he had no right, that he had abandoned them when it mattered most. But beneath her anger was fear. He wasn't wrong about the risks. The sedan watching from the shadows, the ledger full of vanished names, the stain under the linoleum that whispered of violence. And yet, walking away meant silencing Gerald's voice again, burying everything she had uncovered. Daniel's eyes softened briefly as he looked toward the hall, where the children waited out of sight. Lisa, I don't want to fight you. I just want them safe. Sell this place. Get out while you can. He left before she could answer, his boots thudding against the weak steps, the door rattling in its frame. The sound of his truck pulling away echoed long after the engine had faded. Lisa sank into the chair at the table, her hands pressed flat against the wood. For the first time since she had pried open the trailer's walls, she felt the pull of two forces tearing at her: the fierce instinct to protect her children, and the equally fierce need to honor the fragments Gerald Rowe had left behind. The family circle had grown tense, stretched thin by fear and mistrust. And somewhere in the silence that followed Daniel's departure, Lisa realized she would soon have to choose which weight she could carry without breaking. The knock on the door came mid-morning, when Lisa was still sorting through the envelopes she had pulled from the hollow wall days before. She expected another lecture from Marisol, or, worse, a return visit from Daniel. Instead, a tall, stooped man stood on the step, his gray hair curling slightly at the edges of a worn cap. He carried a satchel over one shoulder and leaned on a cane more for balance than necessity. His eyes, though softened by age, had the sharpness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the world in documents. "Mrs. Moreno?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. Lisa hesitated. "Yes. Can I help you?" The man nodded politely. "My name is Arthur Klein. I taught history at the State University for 40 years. I heard about some of the things you've uncovered in this trailer." Lisa stiffened. "From who?" "Word travels," he said, offering the faintest smile. "The park has a way of carrying stories. Your sister mentioned something to a librarian, and it found its way to me. I know the Rowe name. I've studied the plant where he worked. May I come in?" Lisa stepped aside reluctantly, watching him with cautious eyes as he lowered himself into a chair at the kitchen table. He set the satchel down and drew out a pair of thin gloves, the kind archivists used. "You found boxes, yes? Deeds, bonds, old certificates." Lisa blinked in surprise. "Yes, 6 tin boxes, full of papers from companies that don't even exist anymore." Professor Klein nodded, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "Not worthless, Mrs. Moreno. Not at all. Those papers are threads in a larger weave. In the 70s, the textile plant was more than it seemed. It was a hub, a cover. Dozens of small companies across the state, shipping firms, lumber outfits, even banks, were involved in moving goods under false records. Contraband, mostly, though sometimes money laundering as well. When those companies collapsed or were shut down, their records didn't simply vanish. They were gathered, hidden, preserved by men like Gerald Rowe who believed the story should not be lost. Lisa leaned forward, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. "So these boxes, they were part of it? A record?" "Exactly," Klein said, adjusting his glasses. "Each bond, each deed ties back to a network of transactions. By themselves, they may appear useless. Together, they show who was connected. They are evidence, Mrs. Moreno, of how deep the smuggling reached into local institutions. They also explain why men disappeared, to silence record keepers, to erase witnesses." Lisa thought of the ledger, the names crossed out by history itself, the red stain beneath the linoleum. Her chest tightened. Gerald tried to warn someone. He wrote letters. He never sent them. Klein's expression softened. I'm not surprised. Speaking out then would have been dangerous. Even now, remnants of that network may still have eyes. A ledger like his, combined with those documents, could expose names people would rather stay forgotten. Ava, drawn by the low voices, appeared at the doorway. She studied Klein warily, then glanced at her mother. Lisa motioned her closer, and Ava sat beside her, silent but attentive. What do I do with them? Lisa asked finally, her voice low. Klein folded his hands. That depends on what you're willing to risk. Scholars would give anything to study such a collection. Law enforcement might bury it again, claiming it is irrelevant, and those tied to the past may still watch, waiting to reclaim or destroy what you found. You must decide whether to keep these papers hidden or to let them speak. The words hung heavy in the small kitchen. Lisa looked at the stack of boxes, their dull lids lying neatly against the wall. She thought of the sedan idling at night, of Daniel's threats, of Marisol's warnings. She also thought of Gerald Rowe, writing late at night, carving his initials into the wood frame, leaving behind a trail for someone to follow. Professor Klein rose slowly, gathering his satchel. If you wish, I can help you study them. Quietly, but you should understand, what you hold isn't just history, it's testimony. Lisa walked him to the door, her mind churning. When he stepped back into the sunlight and nodded politely before making his way down the lane, she closed the door and leaned against it, her breath uneven. The trailer felt smaller than ever, crowded with secrets waiting to be told. For the first time, she realized her discovery was no longer hers alone. Others knew, others cared, and with knowledge came danger. Professor Klein returned 2 days later, this time carrying a stack of folders and a thin roll of microfilm sealed in a plastic case. He eased himself into the same chair at Lisa's kitchen table, his cane resting against the wall. The trailer felt heavier with him inside, as though his presence carried not just knowledge, but the weight of decades of buried truths. Lisa poured coffee into chipped mugs, her hands trembling slightly as she set one before him. Ava lingered by the counter, pretending to scroll on her phone, though Lisa knew she was listening to every word. Klein adjusted his glasses and spread the folders across the table. Inside were photocopies of old newspaper clippings, typewritten notes, and photographs so faded the figures seemed half ghosts. He tapped one article in particular, the headline nearly illegible. Preservation Brotherhood suspected in missing artifacts. You've heard the name already, haven't you? He asked quietly. Lisa nodded. Gerald's ledger mentioned it once. Just one word. I thought it was nothing. Klein leaned closer. It's not nothing. The Preservation Brotherhood was never a formal organization, not in the sense of uniforms or offices. It was a network. Men who believed that valuable things, money, documents, even artifacts, were safest when hidden. They claimed they were preserving them from corruption, from government hands, from corporations. But in practice, it often became smuggling, theft, or worse. He turned the page, showing her a blurred photograph of men standing near a rail spur, faces partly obscured. Your Gerald wasn't just a factory worker. He was a record keeper. Every network like this had one. Someone quiet, meticulous, who could keep track of what was stored and where it went. His initials carved into your wall weren't simply a mark of residence. They were a claim that Trailer 14 held something for the Brotherhood. Lisa felt the coffee turn sour in her stomach. And the tins? The deeds, the bonds. They're part of a pattern, Klein replied. Across the state, similar caches have been found. In barns under floorboards, behind church altars. Always tin boxes. Always documents tying back to companies that no longer exist. The Brotherhood spread their holdings like seeds, counting on time and silence to protect them. Gerald must have been entrusted with one such stash. Or perhaps he took it for safekeeping, thinking he could guard it better than others. Ava finally spoke, her voice sharp. If they were hiding things everywhere, then why did he disappear? Klein's eyes softened. Because keeping records is dangerous. Those who profit from silence don't forgive men who write everything down. Gerald left evidence of names, routes, and betrayals. And the Brotherhood, despite its lofty name, was not built on trust. When members began to fear exposure, they turned on their own. Lisa thought of the unsent letters, Gerald's plea that if anything happened, it was not an accident. She thought of the sedan that still came at night, waiting. Her hands tightened around the mug until it nearly slipped from her grip. "You think someone still wants these boxes?" "I don't think," Klein said evenly. "I know. Brotherhood remnants linger, families of those involved. Men who were young in the 70s and are still alive today. They remember. And when word spreads of the cache discovered, of ledger pages and letters, they return. They always return." The silence that followed pressed hard against the thin walls of the trailer. Mateo shuffled into the room, sleepy-eyed, and climbed onto a chair beside his mother, oblivious to the depth of what had been said. Lisa brushed his hair back gently, her heart aching at the thought of danger creeping so close. Professor Klein gathered his folders, leaving one behind. This file contained connections between Gerald Rose plant and Brotherhood activity in 3 other counties. Compare it to what you found. The patterns will match. He stood, steadying himself with his cane. "Be careful, Mrs. Moreno. You are holding more than history. You are holding proof that men tried to bury." When he left, the trailer felt colder. Lisa stared at the folder, at the faded photograph of nameless men standing guard over another hidden cache. Trailer 14 was no longer just a ruin she had tried to make livable. It was a vault, marked long ago by a quiet man who had vanished for keeping records. And now, with the Brotherhood stirring again, Lisa wondered if she too had been drawn into a circle that did not allow anyone to walk away. The night stretched long as Lisa sat at the kitchen table with the folder Professor Klein had left behind. The documents inside smelled faintly of mildew and ink, the edges brittle from decades of storage. She laid them out in a line, comparing them against Gerald's ledger and the tin box contents. Patterns emerged the way shadows sharpened under a lantern, routes repeating across counties, names written and then abruptly cut off. Companies dissolved just as quickly as they appeared. It was a trail, but one that ended too suddenly, as though someone had snuffed out the light before it reached its destination. One letter in particular, a carbon copy of correspondence between 2 state investigators in 1979, caught her eye. It referred vaguely to a factory employee who had provided partial testimony regarding irregular shipments, but had failed to appear for a follow-up meeting. No name was given, but Lisa felt the certainty settle in her chest. That employee had been Gerald. He had tried to speak, tried to step beyond the ledger and the unsent letters, but his trail stopped here, in the gap between an initial whisper and the silence that followed. She flipped through more. An article draft from a local reporter mentioned a cache of documents that might surface in connection with the Preservation Brotherhood. But the draft was never published. Scrawled across the margin in pencil were the words, "Source gone cold." Lisa stared at the phrase, her skin prickling. It was another erasure, another place where Gerald's voice had almost broken through before being buried again. The ledger seemed heavier in her hands when she turned back to it. The last entries were hurried, less orderly than the earlier columns. Some names were scratched out with thick lines. Others ended mid-sentence, no payment confirmed, no delivery secured. It was as though Gerald had been interrupted, his record-keeping cut short. One note at the bottom of a page made her throat tighten. Asterisk too many eyes. We'll hide the rest here. Asterisk. Lisa pushed back from the table and paced the narrow kitchen. The red stain beneath the linoleum returned to her mind, dark and permanent, a mark that no cleaning could erase. The sedan outside, the creaks in the hallway at night, they felt less like coincidences now and more like echoes of the same silence that had swallowed Gerald. Whoever had erased his trail might still be ensuring no one pieced it back together. Ava emerged from her room, drawn by the rustle of papers. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded, her face caught between defiance and unease. "You look like him," she said quietly. Lisa turned. "Like who?" "Ro. The way you're sitting here at night, writing things down, chasing patterns no one else wants to see. What they did to him, what they'll do to you." The words stung because they carried truth. Gerald had been silenced before he could reveal the full extent of the stash, And now Lisa was tracing the same fragile path. She looked at her daughter, at the sharp fear hiding behind her tough voice, and wanted to promise that she would never vanish into silence. But promises carried little weight in a place like Trailer 14, where history pressed through every wall. Instead, she returned to the table and stacked the documents together. "The difference," she said softly, "is that he left clues. He wanted someone to find them. That someone just happens to be us." Ava shook her head, retreating back into the shadows of the hallway. Lisa sat alone once more, her hands resting on the ledger. The vanishing trail stretched before her, marked by names cut off midline, companies dissolved overnight, and a man whose testimony had never reached the light. Gerald had tried to preserve the truth, and for that, he had disappeared. Now it was Lisa's turn to decide whether she would let the trail vanish a second time, or whether she would risk following it, even if it led to the same silence that had claimed him. The papers on the table seemed to hum with expectation, daring her to step further into the story Gerald had left unfinished. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and deliberate against a thin aluminum door. Lisa froze where she stood in the kitchen, her hand still on the dish towel. The children looked up from the small table where they had been finishing homework, their faces tense. No one visited at that hour. No one came to Trailer 14 unless they had a reason. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the crooked blinds. Two men stood on the steps, their silhouettes framed in the fading light. Both wore pressed jackets, too clean for the dust of the park. One carried a briefcase. The other kept his hands tucked into his pockets, shifting slightly from foot to foot as though impatient. Their car, a dark sedan, idled near the streetlight at the edge of the lot. Lisa opened the door, only a crack, the chain still hooked. "Yes." The man with the briefcase smiled, but the gesture never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Moreno? We're with a development group looking to revitalize properties in this area. We'd like to make you an offer on your trailer." Her heart thudded. "This place isn't for sale." He nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. "Of course, but you might reconsider when you hear the number. We're prepared to pay you in cash tonight for the deed. More than fair. Enough to get you and your children somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe." The second man finally spoke, his voice lower, rougher. No strings, no paperwork delays, just a clean break. Lisa tightened her grip on the door. She thought of Daniel's warnings, of Professor Klein's quiet caution. She thought of the ledger and the boxes, tucked away in the closet, the papers that tied Gerald Rowe to the Brotherhood. Developers did not show up at night with briefcases and offers of cash. "Why this trailer?" she asked, her voice steady though her pulse raced. The smiling man tilted his head. "We've identified lots with potential. Trailer 14 sits in a promising location. The sooner we can begin, the better for everyone in the park. You'd be doing your neighbors a favor." Ava appeared in the hallway behind her mother, whispering urgently, "Don't listen." Lisa gave a small shake of her head, warning her to stay back. "I'm not interested," Lisa said firmly. "We're staying." The man's smile faltered. His partner shifted closer, his shadow long against the siding. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of their idling car. Then the man with the briefcase snapped it shut and straightened his jacket. "Think carefully, Mrs. Moreno. Opportunities like this don't last. We'll be in touch." They descended the steps without another word, their footsteps heavy against the gravel. The sedan pulled away slowly, its headlights sweeping across the trailer's windows before disappearing into the night. Lisa shut the door and threw the lock, her hands shaking. Ava and Mateo clustered close, their eyes wide. She crouched to meet them, forcing calm into her voice. "They're just trying to scare us. We won't let them." But when she rose, her gaze lingered on the door, on the chain that looked too flimsy to hold against men who had already shown they knew more than they admitted. They hadn't come for the trailer's location. They had come for what Gerald Rowe had hidden in its walls. And now they knew she would not give it up willingly. The night stretched long after that. Every passing car made her tense. Every creak in the floorboards carried weight. Lisa sat at the table with the ledger in front of her, the tin boxes stacked like silent witnesses in the closet. The message had been clear. Money first, Threats next. The Brotherhood's shadow had stepped onto her porch, and the line between past and present had closed around her. Lisa had resisted calling Professor Klein again, afraid that drawing more attention would only increase the pressure already pressing in from every side. But after the late-night visit from the so-called developers, she realized she could no longer carry the weight of the boxes alone. She invited him back one Sunday morning, asking him to bring anyone he trusted who could help her understand exactly what Gerald Rowe had left behind. Klein arrived with 2 colleagues, both retired academics with the look of men who had spent lifetimes in archives rather than offices. One introduced himself as a financial historian, the other as a former archivist who had specialized in estate law. They brought with them thick binders, portable magnifiers, and even a laptop with specialized databases. Their presence filled the tiny kitchen, the table soon buried under stacks of papers pulled carefully from the tin boxes. Ava and Mateo hovered nearby, pretending not to listen, though their wide eyes betrayed them. The financial historian, a thin man named Dr. Hanley, spread out a pile of bonds across the table. He adjusted his spectacles and whistled softly. "These aren't junk, Mrs. Moreno. They're corporate bonds from companies tied to the textile and shipping industries in the 1960s. Most of the companies went under, but some were absorbed by larger firms. That means certain assets, land rights, mineral claims, even freight contracts, rolled over into successors. With the right legal claim, these bonds could be recognized as transferable value." Lisa blinked. "Value? How much?" Hanley didn't answer immediately. He pulled a small calculator from his bag and began scribbling numbers. Some of these matured decades ago. With compound interest, inflation adjustments, and accrued value, you're not talking hundreds or thousands. He looked up, his expression grave. "You're talking millions." The words seemed to echo through the thin-walled trailer. Ava shifted uncomfortably, her mouth parting as though to speak, but no sound came out. Mateo, wide-eyed, whispered, "We're rich." The archivist, a woman named Ruth Alvarez, shook her head gently. "Not rich yet. Wealth like this is complicated. These documents are a puzzle, and without the right context, they're just paper. But in the right hands, with the right legal filings, their value is undeniable. And that," she said, tapping one of the deeds, "is exactly why others want them, because they know what most people would overlook." Lisa steadied herself on the back of a chair, her mind racing. She thought of the developer's late-night visit, of their offer of cash for the deed. It had not been about the land beneath the trailer. It had been about the boxes in her closet. Boxes that Gerald Rowe had hidden, knowing someday someone would understand what they represented. Klein leaned forward, his cane resting against his knee. This is the true value of Gerald's work. He preserved not only a record of corruption, but assets tied to it. Assets that, if revealed, could link men long dead to companies that profited off smuggling and fraud. The money matters, yes, but the story matters more. And those who want the money will do anything to erase the story. Lisa sat down slowly, her hands trembling. Millions. It was more than she could imagine, more than she had ever dared to hope for when she bought the trailer for $300. And yet the weight of it felt suffocating, not liberating. She thought of her children, of the sedan parked in the dark, of Daniel's threats about custody. Wealth was not freedom. It was a target. She gathered the bonds and deeds back into their boxes, her fingers careful, her face pale. "Gerald knew," she whispered. "He knew what they were worth. He knew it would destroy him if anyone found out." The room fell silent, the 3 scholars exchanging uneasy glances. Outside, the hum of traffic from the highway drifted faintly across the park, ordinary sounds that felt distant compared to the enormity of what now rested in her hands. Millions in bonds and deeds, a fortune hidden behind hollow walls. Lisa realized the Brotherhood hadn't been chasing scraps of history. They had been guarding wealth that had outlived its owners. And now that wealth, in all its peril, belonged to her. The morning light slanted weakly across the trailer park, turning the gravel pale and catching the rust along the siding of number 14. Lisa stood in the doorway, the screen bent on one side, the frame cold beneath her hand. Beyond her, the park stirred with the usual motions of Saturday. Children chasing a ball near the road, an old man dragging his trash bin to the curb, the faint hum of radios drifting from open windows. It was an ordinary scene, but Lisa felt the weight of something larger pressing around her, as the thin aluminum walls behind her contained not just her life, but decades of silence and danger. She had not slept much the night before. The words of Professor Klein and his colleagues echoed in her mind, circling with the memory of the men who had stood at her door, offering cash to make everything vanish. The boxes were stacked neatly again in a hollow closet, the ledger hidden in a drawer, the letters tied with string, but they might as well have been spread across the gravel for all the secrecy they provided. The value of what Gerald Rowe had preserved was no longer a mystery. It was a fortune, millions in bonds, deeds, and certificates, but it was also a story, one that powerful men had tried to erase with silence and fear. Lisa looked back into the trailer. Ava sat at the small table, her long hair falling across her face as she scribbled on a notebook, pretending to study but listening for her mother's voice. Mateo had fallen asleep again on the couch, a comic book resting open on his chest. They were the reason she had fought through humiliation at the auction, the reason she had stepped into this ruin with shaking hands and declared it theirs. And now they were the reason she could not run, no matter how tempting the thought of escape had become. She stepped fully into the doorway, the rusted frame creaking under her weight. Her voice carried softly at first, then steadier as she spoke, not to neighbors but to herself, to her children, to whatever shadows still lingered at the edges of the park. This place is not a ruin. It is not just rust and rot. It is a record, a warning, a legacy. Her words surprised her with their firmness. She tightened her grip on the frame and continued. Men tried to bury this. They hid papers in walls and letters in closets, thinking no one would dare to uncover them. But we did. We found them, and I will not let fear take that away. Ava raised her head, her eyes meeting her mother's with a mix of pride and unease. Mateo stirred, murmuring in his sleep, as though even in dreams he could feel the shift in the air. Lisa's gaze swept across the park, lingering on the empty space where the dark sedan had idled so many nights. She knew it would return, and she knew the men behind its wheel would not give up, but she also knew that running would hand them the silence they craved. Standing her ground meant risk, but it also meant honor. To Gerald Rowe, who had carved his initials into the wood and written the truth until the moment he vanished, and her children, who needed to see that ruin could be turned into foundation. She drew a breath and let it settle deep inside her chest. "This is our home now," she said quietly but firmly, "and I will fight to protect it. For them, for him, for all the voices they tried to erase. This trailer is not the end of the story. It is where it begins again." The words lingered in the air, weaving themselves into the thin metal walls, into the wood and the stains and hollow places where secrets had waited for decades. Lisa stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind her. Whatever came next, developers, threats, or shadows from the Brotherhood, she knew she would face it standing, not retreating. Trailer 14 was no ruin. It was a legacy, and it was hers to keep.